Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the itchy, smoky, damp and weirdly clever world of medieval survival. Specifically, the kinds of skills that would make most modern preppers blink, tilt their heads and mutter, "Wait, people did that?" Yeah, they did. And no, you probably won't survive this. Not unless you're willing to get real comfortable with living in a half-sodden pit, lighting fires with fungus, and maybe, just maybe, using some bodily fluids as multi-purpose tools. But more on that in section 3, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know where you're tuning in from tonight. What's your city, and what time is it there? I want to imagine where you're curled up, maybe under a blanket, phone tilted just right, eyes squinting at that soft glow. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're starting with a shelter. Not just any shelter, a moss and mud-walled hovel that smells like a swamp and could possibly double as a frog habitat if you're not careful. You trudge into a clearing, damp earth squelching under your rough boots. No plastic tarp, no titanium stakes, no mylar anything. Just your hands, some twine, and an intimate understanding of how cold the nights get. Here's the trick. Medieval peasants, especially those scraping by in the remote woodlands, learned that the forest wasn't just a hiding place from raiders or tax collectors. It was insulation, fuel, even glue. Start by digging down just a bit, maybe a foot or two, just enough to keep the wind off your ankles and the cold air from dragging across the floor like an invisible snake. Then you pile up logs, interlocking them as best you can. If you've got no logs, thick branches will do. We're not building Versailles, we're trying not to freeze to death. Now for the fun part, moss and mud. The combination isn't just for aesthetic grimminess, it's structural. Grab clumps of moss, thick, green and damp, and start slapping them between the gaps in your logs. Think of it as medieval caulking. The moss swells when it rains, sealing in warmth and keeping out wind. Then you slather mud over that. Yes, mud. The kind that makes a loud squelch when you walk through it. You're not just pasting it on, you're pressing it into every crevice, smoothing it like a baker icing a cake of cold despair. When it dries, that wall won't budge. It smells earthy, almost sour, like wet leaves layered in a forgotten root cellar. But inside, it's warm. In a world without modern insulation, this sloppy mess was a survivalist dream. Better yet, the moss naturally resists mildew and helps regulate humidity. Seriously, medieval people were biohackers before it was cool. Historically, this building method was called wattle and daub, when paired with woven wood lattices. But even without the lattice, just sticking mud and moss together worked in an emergency. If you happened to be in Northern Europe or the British Isles, this was just common sense. The clay-rich soil and abundant moss meant you were never short on materials. The real challenge was keeping the whole thing from collapsing on your face during a storm, hence constant patchwork. And yes, the roof leaked, always. Here's your quirky detail of the night. Some families used to bury a live frog under the central post of their hut for luck and structural strength. Was it magical thinking? Absolutely. But also people noticed fewer collapse-related tragedies when they paid proper respect to the local bog spirits. Real or not, the superstition stuck. Now for the scholarly eyebrow raiser. There's some debate about just how permanent these mud shelters were intended to be. Were they emergency winter hideouts, seasonal hunting cabins, or year-round homes? Archaeologists argue endlessly over the post-hole patterns and decomposition layers. Some even suggest that many of the mud-walled homes we find evidence of might not have been homes at all, but food storage bunkers, temporary smithies, or even crypts. But hey, when you're half-starving and it's snowing sideways, a crypt is still warmer than the open air. Back to you, in your soggy hut. Once your walls are up and the roof's draped in thatch or bark, whatever you can gather, you huddle inside. There's a fire pit in the middle, or maybe just a bed of coals if you're trying not to suffocate from the smoke. The smoke seeps out through a small opening in the ceiling. If you did it right, the fire keeps you warm without gassing you to death. If you didn't, well, you might just get a little closer to those bog spirits than intended. As you sit there, soot on your nose and your hands stained dark with river mud, there's a weird satisfaction. You've created a space from nothing. Ugly, yes. Uneven, absolutely. But functional. And if you hear wolves in the distance, your walls may not stop them, but they might slow them down. This is survival, medieval style. No gear drops, no solar panels, no perfectly cut firewood. Just you, some moss, a bit of hope, and a wall that oozes if you lean on it too hard. Charming. Now that you've got your damp, mud-slick shelter cobbled together and you're not actively freezing to death, you realise something important. You still need fire. And I mean real fire. Not the one-click wonder from a gaslighter or even a reliable modern ferro rod. We're talking about fire the way your medieval ancestors did it, with patience, fungi, and a serious willingness to breathe in some questionable spores. Welcome to the art of fire from fungi. You wake up to the low growl of wind curling around your hovel. Your hands are stiff. Your breath fogs the air in front of you. The embers from last night are dead. Cold, grey ash. No warmth, no breakfast, no light. Just cold. So now what? You step out, crunching over frozen moss and wet leaves, eyes scanning the tree trunks around you. You're not looking for sticks. You're hunting for a weird little miracle, tinder fungus. Also called hoof fungus or Fomes fomentarius, this stuff grows like brownish-grey hooves sticking out of tree bark, usually on dead or decaying birch. To the untrained eye, they look like nothing, like tree warts. But to someone trying to make fire from scratch, these fungi are gold. You break one off, feeling its tough, woody skin. Inside, there's a fibrous, suede-like layer called amadou. That's your real prize. You carve it out gently with a dull blade, or if you're truly medieval about it, a bit of flint. Then, you beat it. No, really. You pound it flat with a stone until it looks like felt, flexible and dry. Think of it like firecloth, but organic and slightly spongy. It even smells earthy, with a hint of old smoke like something that remembers 100 campfires before yours. But amadou doesn't catch fire easily on its own. You need a spark, and unless you're one of the few lucky medieval types who owns a steel striker, you're stuck with flint and iron pyrite, or even just flint and another hard rock if you're desperate. You strike them together again and again, tiny sparks flickering out like dying stars, until one hits your felt-like amadou just right. And then, it smoulders. Not flames, not yet. Just smoke, and a glowing orange coal that slowly eats into the fungus. Now comes the dance. You cradle the smouldering pad in a nest of dry grass, maybe some shredded bark, or cattail fluff if you had the brains to collect it the day before. You blow gently, not like you're blowing out birthday candles, but like you're breathing life into a sleeping dragon. The smoke thickens, swirls, and suddenly, there it is. Flame. Tiny. Flickering. Alive. The first time it works, it's magic. Primitive, sacred magic. Because in that moment, you didn't just start a fire. You resurrected warmth from cold stone and dead fungus. The historical record shows that this technique was so respected that amadou became a literal trade commodity in parts of medieval Europe. Hunters and shepherds carried small fire kits with dried amadou, a striker, and flint in leather pouches. In fact, some regions called it German tinder, and it travelled far and wide, even being used in surgical cauterization, because why not burn your open wound with something you foraged from a tree trunk? Now, for your quirky tidbit of the night. Amadou wasn't just for fire. Nope. People also used it to make hats. Actual, wearable mushroom hats. Light, spongy, and weirdly fashionable. Imagine a stylish medieval peasant walking around with a fungal beret, warm from the head down. Why? Because when you've got limited resources and too much time around sheep, you get creative. But here's where the scholars argue. There's some debate about how widespread this technique really was. Was it the go-to for peasants in every damp forested corner of Europe? Or was it more of a specialty skill passed through certain trades, like shepherds, charcoal burners, and woodsmen? Some argue it was common knowledge. Others suggest most folks wouldn't know a tinder fungus if it slapped them in the face. A few medieval texts mention the fungus by name, but the actual descriptions are frustratingly vague, as if they expected everyone to just know what they meant. Typical. Back to you, still hunched over your small flickering flame. The warmth licks your fingertips. Your hands thaw. Maybe, just maybe, you can heat some water now, or warm last night's bark bread crust. You feel a tiny flicker of pride. You didn't die of hypothermia. You didn't give up and crawl into a hole. You made fire out of a mushroom, that's something. It's easy to romanticize medieval life as noble or quaint, but in moments like these you realize it was mostly grit, and fungi, and repetition. Starting a fire like this isn't a one-and-done deal. It's an everyday ritual, like brushing your teeth, except it takes 45 minutes, smoke stings your eyes, and failure means you don't eat. The ember in the amadou can smoulder for hours. That was another trick. You could wrap it up, carry it through the forest, and use it to spark a new fire later. It wasn't just a one-use miracle, it was portable flame insurance. You might not be able to carry a flame, but you could carry the potential for flame. That was the key, and in a time when life teetered constantly between cold and colder, between comfort and complete collapse, that was everything. Now that your fire's crackling and your mud and moss walls are holding up against the wind like a soggy but determined turtle shell, it's time to turn your attention to something even more primal. Hygiene. Not the luxurious lavender-scented kind. We're talking about the kind of cleanliness that keeps your skin attached to your body and your organs unboiled. And here's the part modern preppers tend to skip over because it's gross and weird and makes people uncomfortable. You're going to need your own pee. Yep. Welcome to the strangely effective and absolutely medieval art of using urine for survival. You're crouched beside your fire, scraping at a crusted pot with a stick, and you're starting to notice that your hands smell off, like rot mixed with wet leather. And your shirt? Let's just say it's holding more bacteria than a high school cafeteria tray. Water alone isn't doing the trick. What you need is a little help from one of the medieval world's most underappreciated cleaning agents, ammonia. And guess where you can get a ready supply of that? From yourself. Back in the medieval day, folks didn't just pee and forget about it. No, they collected it. In jars, in pots, sometimes in buckets tucked under benches. They called it chamber lye once it had aged a bit, because apparently pea stew didn't have the right marketing flair. After a few days, your urine breaks down and releases ammonia, turning it into a basic cleaning fluid, like a homemade medieval bleach, except smellier. This wasn't fringe behaviour. Tanneries used urine to soften hides. Fullers, the poor souls responsible for cleaning wool cloth, stomped it into fabrics to remove grease and grime. It was soap before soap, and yes, it burned, and yes, people gagged. But you know what? It worked. You want your tunic not to smell like disease and despair? Pee in a pot, let it ferment, then soak your clothes in it. Scrub them with rough stones or sand, rinse in a stream, and boom! You're at least a few steps further from dying of skin rot. And the benefits didn't stop at laundry. Medieval apothecaries, bless their wild little hearts, actually prescribed aged urine for wounds, mouth sores, and even acne. You cut your hand while gutting a rabbit. Pour on some of your week-old golden elixir. You probably won't enjoy it, and it definitely stings. But you're also less likely to end up with a hand that looks like overcooked meat. There's even one recorded method of making soap that involves mixing urine with wood ash and boiling it all together until it becomes a slippery grey paste. It sounds like a witch's failed casserole, but it kept people alive. It's also where the idea of lye soap comes from. Lye, that powerful base, was traditionally derived from urine and ashes. Still want that pioneer lifestyle? Better start saving your bathroom breaks. Here's your delightfully weird detail. Medieval folk didn't just collect their own urine, they paid for others. Really. In some towns, families would sell aged urine to local tanneries or fullers, sometimes earning enough for a few loaves of bread or a hunk of cheese. In ancient Rome, slightly pre-medieval but too good to ignore, there were even urine taxes. You had to pay to pee into collection pots that the state then resold. Picture that next time someone complains about income tax. Of course, this brings us to the open debate. Was urine actually effective as a true disinfectant? Some historians argue that, yes, ammonia-rich urine could kill off bacteria and clean wounds in the absence of better options. Others claim it was more about ritual and habit than proven science, that people felt cleaner, even if they weren't. But modern science does back up the idea that ammonia can break down grease and sterilise to a point. Just don't expect it to replace antibiotics, or smell good. Back to you though. You're sitting by your fire holding a clay pot full of last week's leavings, stirring in some wood ash with a stick. It bubbles a little, not encouraging. The stench hits your eyes before your nose. You grimace, but you dip a rough cloth into the brew and start scrubbing at your filthy shirt. It takes effort, and maybe a few gag breaks, but soon enough the stains fade, the grime loosens, and the cloth feels better. Not fresh exactly, but not like it could get up and walk away on its own. Then you hang it over a stick near the fire to dry, hoping the smoke masks the odour. It won't. But it's symbolic, and sometimes that's enough. And while we're here, it's worth noting that this isn't just about cleanliness, it's also about psychology. In a world where everything feels damp, dirty, and vaguely cursed, taking control of your environment, even if it involves your own bodily fluids, is empowering. It's your tiny rebellion against decay, against giving up. So next time someone flexes their prepper gear, tactical soap pellets, sanitizing tablets, minty fresh hygiene kits, just smile and ask them if they've considered peeing into a clay pot and scrubbing their clothes with lye they made themselves. Then watch the conversation die faster than bacteria in a vat of fermented chamber lye. And if you're still grossed out, good. That means you're still a little bit civilized, but not too civilized to survive. So now that you're warm, your shirt is slightly less plague-scented, and you've accepted that your most reliable cleaning agent comes from your bladder, it's time to talk food. Not the kind that crackles in a pan or slides from a foil pouch. Nope. You're going full medieval famine mode tonight. You're about to eat trees, or more specifically, acorns and bark. Welcome to the not-so-gourmet world of acorn flour and bark bread. You start by walking through the woods, eyes peeled not for berries or mushrooms, but for oak trees. Big ones. Old ones. Their roots twist like frozen snakes, and their branches creak overhead with the weight of 1,000 years of people cursing up at them, hungry and desperate. Acorns scattered all over the ground look promising. Nutty, solid, even kind of cute. You gather them by the armful, dropping them into a crude sack you've sewn from scraps and twine. But here's the catch. Raw acorns will ruin you. Unprocessed acorns are packed with tannins, bitter compounds that make your mouth feel like it's been sandblasted and your stomach feel worse. They're mildly toxic in quantity, which is unfortunate, since quantity is exactly what you need to survive the week. So, you do what a medieval villager would have done. You leech them. Not emotionally, you've already cried that out, but chemically. First you crack them open with a rock, revealing the pale inner meat. Then you crush that into coarse bits and dump it into a cloth sack. Now comes the time-consuming part, soaking. You tie the sack to a branch and dunk it in a stream, letting the tannins slowly wash out over several days. If you don't have a stream handy, you'll be boiling them repeatedly in multiple changes of water. Your hut starts to smell faintly like a nutty tea shop mixed with wet bark, which is either comforting or awful, depending on how long you've gone without real food. Once the water runs clear and the bitterness is mostly gone, you dry the acorn bits near your fire. After they're hard again, you grind them into flour with a flat stone and a lot of patience. The resulting powder is coarse, brownish, and faintly sweet. Acorn flour doesn't behave like wheat flour. It doesn't rise, doesn't stretch, and definitely doesn't fluff. But it does fill your stomach. That's what matters now. To make bread from it, you mix the flour with water, maybe a pinch of salt if you've got any, or some wild herbs if you're feeling festive. The dough is dense and sticky, almost clay-like. You flatten it into little discs and slap them onto hot stones by the fire, flipping them until they harden into bark-coloured patties. The smell? Surprisingly toasty. The texture? Less bread and more edible roof shingle. But you eat it anyway, chewing slowly, jaw working like a medieval cow. It sticks to your teeth and your ribs. You don't smile while you eat it, but you don't cry either. Progress. Now, if you're really in survival mode, you take it further. You add literal bark to your recipe. No, not the green mossy stuff, inner bark. You find pine or birch, strip away the rough outer layer, and shave off thin curls of the cambium, the softer stringy part beneath. Then you dry it, grind it, and mix it into your acorn flour like the saddest spice blend in history. This kind of bread, sometimes called famine bread, wasn't a rare thing. During sieges, hard winters, or just a particularly bad harvest, bark bread showed up on tables across Scandinavia and Eastern Europe. In Norway and Finland, people even developed traditional techniques to make it palatable, soaking and baking the bark to bring out its starches. In some regions, it became so common that elders passed down their best bark bread recipes. You know a civilization has struggled when they have family secrets about which tree tastes least like despair. Here's a weird little fact to chew on. In some cases, the cambium was eaten raw as a spring tonic. People believed it helped cleanse the blood and prepare the body for warmer seasons. Whether or not that's true, one thing's certain. It kept people alive when there was nothing else to eat. Trees, literally, became bread. Now for the scholarly debate. Some historians argue that bark bread wasn't just a famine food, but a planned supplement. That people actively harvested bark each year as part of their food system, like you might harvest wild greens. Others disagree, insisting that bark bread was strictly a desperation meal, only eaten when there were no alternatives. The evidence is murky, mostly because the bark doesn't leave behind many clues once it's been chewed into paste and cooked over a firestone. Back in your shelter, you lean back with a fullish stomach, the bark bread sitting heavy in your gut like a rock that knows secrets. It's not satisfying exactly, but you're no longer shaking from hunger. The fire flickers. You reach for another patty, tear off a piece with your teeth and chew slowly. It tastes like effort, like tree, like survival. You think about how far removed modern life is from this kind of meal, about how people now pay extra for paleo flour or foraged ingredients, while medieval folks were literally trying not to starve. Bark bread isn't a fun experiment, it's a last resort wrapped in ash and hunger, but it works, and tonight, that's enough. You wake to the sound of wind scraping through the trees like whispered warnings, and your first thought, other than "I survived another night," is that it's still too dark. Your fire's nothing but a cold pile of ash, and the last of your bark bread is stiff enough to chip a tooth. You need light, warmth, and maybe even a little psychological boost. What you don't have? Candles. What you do have? Bones. Tonight we're going full medieval mood lighting, bone oil lamps. Before you flinch, remember, this isn't about aesthetics, it's about survival. And when the sun sets at 4 in the afternoon, and your only company is the sound of wolves howling in stereo, even a flickering flame makes all the difference. So you grab what's left of last night's dinner, a rabbit carcass maybe, or the femur from some unlucky forest creature that met its end near your hut. No judgment. The first step is cracking that bone open. You take a sharp rock, or if you're lucky, a rusted blade, and split the shaft with a series of heavy strikes. It takes effort, and the bone resists like it's protecting something sacred, which in a way it is. Inside is the marrow. Thick, fatty, and slick. It clings to the hollow with a waxy stubbornness. You scoop it out with your fingers, still cold and red from the morning air. It smells faintly like iron and old broth. This is your fuel. Now you need a container. In a perfect world, you'd have a carved stone or a ceramic bowl, but let's be real. This is your moss hut survival life. So you improvise. Maybe a hollowed-out chunk of wood, or the curved half of a turtle shell if you've scavenged well. You press the marrow into it, pack it down, then twist together a wick, scraps of cloth, a bit of moss, or twisted fibres from bark. If you're feeling especially thrifty, maybe even a lock of your own hair. Don't laugh. Hair wick surprisingly well. Once your makeshift lamp is ready, you light the wick from a coal or spark, and there it is. The tiniest flame, dancing like it knows it's doing something ancient and important. The marrow burns slow and steady, releasing a greasy scent. Not pleasant, but comforting in its way. It fills the hut with a soft orange glow, flickering shadows across the walls, turning mud into gold and moss into velvet. In the Middle Ages, this wasn't just some fringe behaviour. Poor households across Europe lit their homes with all sorts of improvised lamps. Olive oil was for the rich, beeswax candles, expensive. Tallow, rendered animal fat, was common, but even that had to be rendered in bulk. When all else failed, you used what you had. Bones, drippings, scraps, anything that would burn and give you a few precious hours of light. Shepherds, forest dwellers, even battlefield camps used these lamps, often keeping them going all night beside sleeping children or wounded soldiers. Here's your strange but true tidbit. In some parts of medieval Eastern Europe, burning a bone lamp wasn't just about light. It was believed to keep away evil spirits. The smell of burning marrow was said to drive off malicious forest creatures or restless ghosts. Maybe it was superstition. Maybe it was just that even ghosts couldn't handle the smell. Either way, you're not turning it off. Of course, scholars love to argue about the origins and frequency of bone oil lamps. Some suggest that they were mostly post-apocalyptic fixes, used during times of plague or famine, not everyday life. Others claim they were common among specific rural communities, particularly where access to tallow or oils was limited. The archaeological evidence is scarce. Burnt bone fragments and soot-stained vessels only tell you so much. Was it a desperate trick or a regular evening ritual? Like most things medieval, it probably depended on where and who you were. Back in your hut, the light plays across your tired face. Your hands still smell faintly of marrow and your stomach growls. The lamp doesn't make you full, it doesn't make you warm, but it makes you feel less alone, like you've joined a long, unbroken chain of humans who've burned whatever they could to push back the dark. Some of them survived, some didn't. But they all lit the same kind of flame, and right now, that counts for something. You crouch closer, holding your hands to the warmth. The wick sputters, catches again. Maybe you hum a tune, something you barely remember, something your grandmother might have sung once. The hut smells like wood smoke, damp wool, and scorched marrow. It's disgusting, it's perfect. You sit with your tiny fire not because it's efficient, but because it makes your mud walls feel like home. Light, no matter how small, does that. Even when it comes from the inside of a bone. The light from your bone oil lamp flickers gently through the night, casting warm, ghost-dancing shadows on your mud-streaked walls. It's late, and sleep is pulling at your eyelids like gravity. But there's one problem. You can't exactly lie back on a memory foam mattress and drift into REM cycles while a snowstorm howls just outside your mossy front door. If you don't sleep smart, you won't wake up at all. This is where your medieval ancestors get the last word. Time to learn the art of sleeping through a blizzard, with nothing but a cloak, the ground, and a method that feels like a half-finished blanket burrito. Welcome to the cloak cocoon technique. You start by checking your bed, which is really just a patch of semi-dry ground padded with ferns and maybe a few layers of evergreen boughs you gathered yesterday. It's not soft, but it lifts your body just enough off the cold soil to keep you from bleeding heat like a dropped potato. The real star of the show tonight, though, is your cloak. This isn't your Halloween store vampire cape. This is a thick woolen rectangle, heavy and scratchy, probably dyed some medieval shade of brownish sadness, and reeking faintly of smoke, sweat, and livestock. But here's the genius. Medieval cloaks were multifunctional survival tools. Worn loose during the day, wrapped tight at night, they became the difference between waking up and becoming a very sad medieval popsicle. You kneel on one end of the cloak and roll yourself in diagonally, burrito style, tucking the sides under your body to trap warmth. The trick is creating layers, air pockets between wool and skin that your body heat can actually warm. It's not about tightness, it's about insulation. If you're lucky enough to have two cloaks, or a spare blanket, you layer one over the other like a sad lasagna, and if you're really lucky, you've got a sleeping partner. Body heat was a hot commodity in the Middle Ages. Literally. People didn't sleep alone unless they had money, power, or a death wish. This is where we break a modern prepping myth. Despite what your favourite survival show told you, piling on extra clothes in winter isn't always the best move. Medieval folk knew that if you overdressed for sleep, you'd sweat under all that fabric, and once you're damp, that moisture becomes your worst enemy. The chill sets in, and it's good night forever. So instead, you sleep cold, slightly underdressed, wrapped in dry wool, trusting the cloak and your fire to do their jobs. And let's not forget positioning. You sleep curled in the fetal position, knees to chest, hands tucked under your arms. It's not about comfort, it's about conserving heat. Your body is a radiator. You want as little surface area exposed as possible. In fact, some medieval folks would build low, coffin-like sleeping pits next to their fires, using stones or logs as partial walls to shield them from drafts. You're not just lying on the ground, you're tucking into it like a cat folding into a blanket that smells vaguely of smoke and goat. Here's the weird historical detail. In some parts of medieval Europe, people believed that sleeping with your head too close to the fire could boil your brains. So they'd place their heads farthest from the flame, even if that meant icy breath curling from their mouths all night long. Science? Not quite. But the caution led to the side-sleeping, curled position being passed down as folk wisdom, and honestly, they weren't wrong about the danger of direct exposure. Smoke inhalation was real. Dying in your sleep from a poorly vented fire pit wasn't just a possibility, it was a regular Tuesday. Now, of course, scholars love to wrestle over the details. Some claim the cloak cocoon method was more common among shepherds and travellers than town dwellers, who often slept in drafty lofts with animal skins and shared beds. Others argue that cloaks were just one part of a bigger insulation strategy. Layered straw bedding, animal furs, even warmed bricks tucked under blankets. But archaeological finds and surviving accounts suggest that the wool-wrapped fetal position approach was a well-known trick among everyone from knights to peasants to monks dozing off in damp stone cells. Back in your hut, you blow out your bone lamp and tuck your body into its wool cocoon. The fire is just coals now, red, faintly pulsing like the last heartbeat of the day. Wind presses against the walls, testing the seams of your muddy insulation. But inside your little roll you're warm enough, Not cozy, not comfortable, but alive. You close your eyes and try not to think about the rats that might sneak in, or the snow piling up on the roof, or the fact that your bed smells like damp dog and foot. Instead, you let your body settle into stillness, your breath slowing. You become part of the silence. The cloak hugs you back with every breath. There's no alarm clock, no mattress springs, no white noise machine, just the ancient rhythm of your heart and the crackle of dying embers. Somewhere in the vast, cold woods, another poor soul is probably wrapping themselves in their own cloak, praying for the sun. And just like them, you wait for the first hint of light through the smoke hole in your roof. If it comes, you'll get up, shake off the frost, stretch, make another bark biscuit and try to outlive the day. If it doesn't come, well, at least you're wrapped in wool. And that's more than most get. Morning comes slow, the light through your smoke hole is faint, filtered by a pale sky heavy with more snow. Your joints creak as you unwrap yourself from your cocoon of wool, your body stiff and chilled but miraculously still functioning. You stretch, yawn, and wonder, once again, how many more nights of this you can survive. But then you notice something unsettling. A cut on your forearm, small but raw, the edge swollen and a little too red. That was from yesterday's rabbit bone, probably. You didn't think much of it then, but now, in the bitter cold and filth, a wound is an invitation for rot, for fever, for slow death. So what do? You reach for a spider web. No, not as a metaphor. Literally, a spider web. This is the moment you finally appreciate how weird and wonderful medieval medicine really was. While modern preppers are stocking up on antiseptic wipes and antibiotic ointments, medieval survivors were out here plucking cobwebs from barn rafters and rubbing them into open wounds. And somehow they weren't entirely wrong. You head outside, brushing snow off your shoulders, and look under the eaves of a nearby tree hollow. Sure enough, a web hangs there, light, gauzy, and still clinging to frozen dew. You carefully gather it on a twig, winding it around like a soft ribbon. Back in your hut, you clean the wound as best you can. Some melted snow, a bit of moss, a brief prayer that your hands aren't dirtier than the cut itself. Then you press the spider silk into the gash. The sensation is strange. The web clings instantly, stretching and moulding to your skin like it belongs there. It's almost elegant, if elegance could exist inside a muddy forest hovel. And surprisingly, it works. The silk helps stop bleeding, and because spider webs are naturally antimicrobial, yes, that's a real thing. It actually helps prevent infection. Modern science has confirmed what medieval folk figured out by necessity. The proteins in spider silk inhibit the growth of certain bacteria. It's nature's gauze, and for centuries it was one of the few sterile materials peasants had access to. Of course, not everyone just slapped webs onto their wounds. In some traditions, the web had to be gathered under specific conditions. At dawn, for example, or from a churchyard spider. And if you really wanted to do things the old way, you'd chant a little rhyme while you applied it. One English folk charm went, "Spider, spider, spinning tight, stitch my wound and bind it right." Was it medicine, magic, survival? The line between those three was always blurred in the Middle Ages. And here's your fringe fact for the night. In parts of rural Germany, spiderwebs weren't just used for healing, they were part of war gear. Knights would pack small rolls of web into their kits, ready to stuff into wounds during battle. Some even claimed specific types of spider silk helped stop arrows from festering. Of course, that sounds like something you tell yourself while slowly bleeding out in a muddy field. But hey, belief is powerful. And if nothing else, it distracted from the screaming. There's a lingering academic debate about just how widespread this practice was. Some historians argue that web medicine was more folklore than function, a kind of mystical folk remedy used only when there were no real options. Others push back, citing evidence from medieval apothecary texts and physicians who described web application alongside treatments using honey, vinegar, and herbs. In the absence of antibiotics, webs offered at least something, not a cure, but a pause. A thin line between a clean scab and a fevered spiral into death. Back in your hut, you wrap a strip of cloth over the silk to hold it in place, then settle back near your fire. The sting fades. The throbbing slows. It might heal, it might not. But you've done what people have done for centuries. Looked around at the chaos of the natural world and said, you'll help. And isn't that what all survival is? Finding strange allies in unlikely places? The spider, still nestled in its frozen hollow, goes back to its work, spinning what it spins, unaware it's part of something bigger than just catching flies. You too pull your cloak tighter, sip some lukewarm water and breathe. You've turned a web into a shield. Not bad for a peasant with nothing but bone grease and bark bread. The days blend together in the woods, one long smear of grey sky, damp socks and firewood that's never dry enough. But today, you wake with a small, strange sense of calm. The wound on your arm looks better. The spider web did its job, or maybe you just got lucky. Either way, you're still breathing, which in medieval terms is basically a victory lap. But before you can feel too smug, a new problem nudges at your senses. Your hut reeks, not just of smoke and sweat, but of stale air, trapped breath, and the sour musk of a body living too close to its own cooking fumes. This isn't just unpleasant, it's dangerous. So, today's lesson: ventilation, medieval style. It turns out that the design of your humble shelter isn't just about keeping rain out or wolves from gnawing at your legs. It's also about air, how to let it flow just enough to keep you alive but not enough to freeze your nose off. This is where smoke holes and soul holes come into play. You step outside for a moment, take a deep breath of crisp air, and look up at your thatched roof. There's a hole at the top, not a flaw, but a feature. You left it there on purpose, more or less. It's your smoke hole, and it's the single most important architectural detail your shelter has. Without it, the smoke from your fire would collect inside, settle in the rafters, and suffocate you in your sleep, which, let's be honest, is not the cosy, fireside death anyone wants. Medieval homes, especially the peasant kind, often had no chimneys. A central fire burned on a hearthstone or even just a patch of clear dirt, and the smoke drifted upward, curling toward a hole in the roof. It blackened the beams, turned cobwebs into lace made of soot, and left your lungs feeling like you'd been kissing a torch. But it worked. Barely. And here's where things get interesting. In some regions, the smoke hole wasn't just practical, it was spiritual. Enter the concept of the soul hole. People believed that when someone died inside the home, their soul needed a way to escape. So they'd open the smoke hole wide, or in some cases create a special opening just for the soul to exit. Some cultures even insisted on orienting the body so the spirit would float upward and out through that precise spot. Because if you didn't, the soul might linger. Or worse, stay angry. You look at your own smoke hole now, a jagged gap in the thatch, and wonder who else's soul has passed through a space like that. How many ghosts took the upward route and didn't look back? It's strangely comforting, knowing that your hut isn't just a place for sleeping and soup. It's a portal of sorts. A one-way exit for the metaphysical traffic of the desperate and the dead. From a survival perspective, though, your soul hole is doing overtime. The fire you built last night left the walls hazy with soot, and you're coughing more than usual. You grab a stick and poke through the hole to widen it slightly, letting the smoke spiral up and out into the trees. Immediately the air shifts. It's subtle, like a sigh. The pressure inside your hut equalizes, and for the first time in hours your eyes stop watering. Some medieval builders were clever about this. In Scandinavian longhouses, the smoke hole was carefully aligned with prevailing winds. In Slavic huts, it was shielded with overlapping bark panels that could be adjusted. And in Alpine cottages, the entire roof sometimes lifted slightly at one edge to let air escape like a sneeze. All of this without blueprints or degrees in thermodynamics. Just centuries of trial, error, and coughing. Of course, the scholars debate the origin and evolution of the soul hole idea. Was it purely spiritual from the start, or did the practical need for ventilation become mythologized over time? Some argue that ancient burial mounds with vents or stone openings may have inspired the practice. Others claim it's a classic case of religious reinterpretation, people taking an architectural necessity and giving it symbolic weight. Either way, the soul hole stuck around right up until chimneys came into fashion centuries later and made things a little less poetic and a lot less smoky. Back in your hut, the change is instant. With the smoke hole cleared and your fire burning low, the air feels, if not fresh, then at least survivable. You can taste the difference. Your nose no longer feels like it's been scrubbed with charcoal. Your breath no longer catches. You sit near the entrance, letting the fire's heat brush your face while a new breeze dances in overhead, stirring the soot just slightly, like a hand ruffling your hair. You wonder absently how many people in history sat exactly like this, quiet, smudged with smoke, listening to wind move through a hole they cut in their own roof, thinking not just of warmth, but of spirits, of breathing, of being, and not dying. Because out here, even your ceiling has a job. It lets things out. Smoke, spirits, the past. You lean back, stare up through the hole and exhale. It vanishes into the sky. By now, you've probably given up on ever smelling nice again. Your clothes are stiff from smoke and sweat. Your boots, if you can still call them that, are caked with mud, and you're on a first-name basis with your own grime. But then you glance down at your feet, specifically your shoes, or rather what's left of them. The leather has cracked, the seams have split, and one toe is poking out like it's trying to escape. Which brings us to today's medieval survival technique, scavenge the dead. More precisely, we're dead men's boots. It sounds grim, and yeah, it is. But it was also incredibly practical. In the Middle Ages, leather was life. Tough, durable, weather-resistant, good leather made the difference between a survivor and a frostbitten corpse. And when the living didn't have any to spare, the dead became your tailor. You're out walking far from your hut, maybe tracking a half-frozen deer trail when you spot it, a mound in the snow, awkward and motionless. You approach slowly, because let's face it, there's always a chance it's not dead. But no, it's a man, or what's left of one. His cloak is stiff with ice, his hands curled around nothing. Maybe he froze or starved, or just laid down for a moment and never got up. It's not your job to guess. It's your job to survive. And that means boots. You crouch beside him and inspect. They're rough leather, the soles patched with rawhide, the lace is little more than twisted sinew, still intact, still warmish, and definitely in better shape than the two mismatched foot pouches you're currently wearing. So you do what any medieval traveller, peasant or war-weary soldier would do, you take them. There's no ceremony, no moment of silence, just fingers working fast to untie frozen laces and tug the boots free. You don't know his name, but whoever he was, he's now your shoemaker. This was disturbingly common in the Middle Ages. Battlefields were looted not just for swords or coins, but for boots. After a fight, the first ones out scavenging weren't always there for weapons. They were after shoes. Soldiers stripped the dead of usable leather, cloaks, belts, anything that would keep them warmer or drier the next day. In villages, if someone passed during the winter and their family didn't bury them right away, their clothing often found new homes. Leather especially. It was never wasted. And it wasn't just boots. In times of famine or war, people scavenged anything off the dead. Hats, gloves, even teeth. Yes, really. Some desperate folks would pull teeth from corpses to sell or replace their own. It's horrifying, it's resourceful, it's peak medieval. Here's your bizarre fact of the night. Some graves were robbed specifically for footwear. In parts of medieval Ireland, there are records of bodies being dug up not for valuables or jewellery, but for boots. Leather was so scarce and so prized that even burial couldn't guarantee you kept your shoes. If you had good boots when you died, chances are someone walked away in them. Now, of course, this opens the door to a juicy scholarly debate. Some historians argue that the looting of the dead was more about battlefield efficiency than survival, that soldiers weren't scavenging out of desperation, but out of discipline, collecting gear for the next fight. Others say, no way, this was sheer survival instinct. The freezing poor and the half-starved rural communities treated the battlefield as a bizarre kind of second-hand shop. It's hard to pin down the full truth, but bones don't lie, and many have been found stripped of everything but their name. Back in your own miserable timeline, you lace up the dead man's boots. They're a bit tight, smell faintly like smoke and old sweat, but they hold your foot better than anything you've worn in weeks. The soles are thick, the leather still soft at the ankles. You take a few steps, cautiously, like you're breaking in someone else's memories. It feels strange, like trespassing in reverse. You wonder who he was. A traveller? A hunter? Someone just trying to get back to a family that will never know where he fell? You could let your mind go there. You could let yourself feel the weight of it. But you're too hungry, too tired, too raw. Grief is a luxury now. Sentiment doesn't patch holes or warm toes, so you do what people have always done. You move on. His boots, your feet. That's the exchange. You offer no thanks, and he demands none. By the time you return to your hut, your footprints are cleaner, deeper, more confident. Your toes aren't frozen stubs. You can walk longer, farther. That pair of boots might just buy you another week of life. And in the Middle Ages, another week was everything. The dead man's boots have bought you some time, warm toes, better footing, and a reminder that survival sometimes means stepping into the story someone else didn't get to finish. But as you trudge through the forest trails day after day, something else starts to nag at you. Your teeth. Not one in particular, just all of them. They feel fuzzy, grimy, like each one is slowly turning into a miniature tombstone for forgotten hygiene. You run a finger along your gums and wince. Infection starts in the mouth, and you know it. So tonight, while modern preppers are bragging about their toothbrushes made from bamboo and tactical toothpaste, you're going full medieval. It's time to polish your teeth with ash and charcoal. Back at your hut, you crouch beside your fire pit, picking through the ashes for the right kind. Soft, white-grey, not too gritty. You avoid the bits that still smell like burnt bone. What you're after is the powdery kind that comes from clean, dry wood. Once you've gathered a handful, you take a flat stone and crush it down finer, adding in a chunk of charcoal for good measure. Charcoal alone was a known tooth-cleaning agent, even in ancient times, and the medieval folk weren't shy about grinding it down with pestles and scrubbing their molars raw. You spit into the ash pile, don't think about it too hard, and use your finger as a brush, dipping it into the mixture and dragging it across your teeth. The taste is something between old campfire and damp gravel. It's not pleasant, but you feel the difference instantly. The grit scrapes away the fuzz, the build-up, the biofilm. It's like medieval exfoliation for your mouth. You rinse with a handful of warmish water, and your gums tingle with a mix of slight pain and clean. This was common practice among anyone who could afford a mirror, or, more often, those who couldn't. Monks, soldiers, travellers, even bored shepherds would use ash, salt, or crushed herbs like sage and mint to freshen their mouths. It wasn't just about hygiene, it was about health. Medieval doctors knew that rotting teeth led to disease, even if they didn't fully understand bacteria. And they knew one terrifying truth. A tooth infection left untreated could kill you. Slowly, agonizingly, through your jaw, your bloodstream, or your brain. So they cleaned. Not often enough by today's standards, but enough to matter. Here's your delightfully odd fact. In some medieval apothecary records, there are tooth powders made from burnt eggshells, crushed deer antlers, and even powdered oyster shells. Mixed with vinegar or wine, these were used not only to clean teeth, but to whiten them. That's right. People have been chasing white teeth long before Hollywood. Even in an age where nobody bathed more than twice a month, white teeth were considered a sign of good breeding, or at least a mouth that wasn't actively trying to kill you. But of course, the scholarly debate lingers. Did these methods actually work? Some researchers argue that medieval tooth-cleaning habits were sporadic at best, more tied to ritual than routine. Others point to dental remains from medieval graves and note that, while tooth loss was common, actual cavities were less frequent than you'd expect. Why? Possibly because sugar, the biggest enemy of teeth, was rare and expensive. Your average peasant wasn't eating candy. They were gnawing on bark bread and drinking weak ale. Terrible for morale, but surprisingly okay for molars. Still, oral hygiene varied wildly. Nobles might rinse with rose water or chew scented pastes, while peasants used salt and ashes, if they remembered at all. There were even tiny twigs from trees like birch or hazel, chewed until they frayed into bristles then used to scrub teeth. Essentially, prehistoric toothbrushes. You're not quite that fancy tonight, so you improvise with a twig from your firewood pile, gnawing one end into a fibrous scrubber. You sit back near the fire, slowly rubbing the twig across your front teeth, like someone who's just discovered self-care after months of self-neglect. There's something meditative about it. The repetition, the scrape, the sting. When you spit, the water's a bit grey, and you half wonder if that's tooth dust or just ash. Either way, your mouth feels cleaner than it has in weeks. It's not minty fresh, but it no longer feels like a breeding ground for medieval mouth demons. There's no mirror, of course. You check your reflection in a puddle, vaguely catching the outline of your face under the ripples. Your teeth gleam, sort of. They're still crooked, still stained, but they're yours, and they're still in your skull, which is really the only standard that matters out here. You stretch your jaw, suck in a breath, and feel a spark of relief. In a life where you're constantly fighting for the next meal, the next warm night, the next reason to keep going. Taking care of something small, like your teeth, feels like rebellion, like control, like hope. And hope tastes a little like ash and charcoal. Clean teeth or not, hunger never really leaves. It just waits. Sometimes it's quiet, sitting somewhere behind your ribs like a forgotten ache. Other times, it grabs you by the spine and drags you out of your shelter with a single goal. Find food. The fire's dying down, your bark bread reserves are gone, and the snow has muffled every familiar rustle in the forest. But your stomach doesn't care. So today, you're learning the art of catching fish medieval style, with 0 hooks, 0 lines, and almost 0 effort. Welcome to the sneaky, wildly effective world of basket traps and fish weirs. You set off before sunrise, boots crunching over the icy ground, breath fogging ahead like a warning. There's a creek nearby, narrow but moving fast enough to avoid freezing over completely. That's your hunting ground for the day, not for deer or rabbits, but for the cold-blooded, silent swimmers beneath the surface. You have no rod, no reel, and no bait to speak of, but you've got something better. Ancient trickery. The first technique is the basket trap. It's as simple as it sounds and as brilliant as anything humans have ever invented. You find a few long bendable branches, willow is perfect if you can spot it, and begin weaving them into a cone shape, narrow at one end and wide at the other, like a fish-sized funnel. It doesn't need to be pretty, just functional. You work slowly, fingers stiff in the cold, bending and twisting the branches until they lock into place. The whole thing looks like a crude megaphone designed by someone who really hates fish. Then you weigh it down with rocks and drop it into a calm part of the stream, wide mouth facing upstream. The idea is beautifully simple. Fish swim into the wide opening, drawn by the current or curiosity, and then can't figure out how to back out through the narrow neck. It's passive fishing at its finest. No patience required, just time. While that's soaking, you move on to the second method, the fish weir. This one's more work, but it's got real medieval street cred. You start hauling rocks into the shallows, stacking them into a rough V-shape with the open end pointing downstream. It's a lot like herding fish with invisible arms. As they swim upstream, which they always do this time of year, they hit the wall and naturally funnel toward the point of the V. And waiting at that point, a basket. Or maybe just your cold, bare hands. Medieval people all across Europe used versions of this setup. Rivers were often dotted with weirs, built from stone, wood stakes, or woven fencing, some stretching dozens of feet across. In fact, in some places, weirs were so effective they caused legal trouble. Lords and kings had to pass laws limiting their use because they were emptying entire rivers of fish. That's how you know a technique works, when the government has to step in and say, "Okay, that's enough fish for you." You finish stacking the rocks and take a break, sitting on a flat stone while the water rushes by. There's a strange comfort in the noise. It doesn't feel modern. It feels ancient, like the sound of time moving forward regardless of what's happening to you. You lean back and remember something odd. In medieval monasteries, fish wasn't just food, it was salvation. On fasting days, of which there were many, monks couldn't eat meat, but fish was allowed. So fish became this weird, holy loophole in the diet. Entire religious calendars were built around catching the right fish at the right time. Here's a fun fringe detail for the night. In medieval England, someone once trained otters to catch fish for the manor kitchens. Trained. Otters. They even had collars and were fed special diets to keep them loyal. Imagine it. Some overworked servant walking a leashed otter down to the river, muttering about Lent and trying to keep it from chasing ducks. It sounds ridiculous, but it happened. Of course, the debate among historians is whether passive fishing methods like these were everyday survival tools, or more of a seasonal large-scale event. Some argue that weirs were built by communities, not individuals, used during spawning seasons to catch and salt enough fish to last for months. Others point to personal basket traps and say no, people used these all the time. Quiet, efficient, solitary fishing, the medieval version of checking your inbox. Back at your trap you check the basket, nothing yet. But the weir looks promising. Tiny ripples hint at movement. You crouch low, hand hovering just above the surface, and then, there it is, a flicker of silver. You lunge, hands plunging into icy water, grabbing wildly until your fingers close around something slimy and panicked. You pull it out, gasping from the cold, and there it is, a small fish. Not impressive, not enough to feast on, but it's protein. It's something your body can turn into warmth, into breath, into tomorrow. You kill it quick, thankful and efficient, then reset the trap. As you walk back to your shelter, fish in hand, you smile for the first time in days. Not a big smile, just a private little flicker. Because you didn't wait for a deer to walk into your line of sight. You didn't chase rabbits for hours in the snow. You tricked a fish. You outthought something with fins and gills and a very small brain. And that, in the medieval world, makes you clever. Alive. Still in the game. Back at your fire, the fish sizzles on a flat stone, skin curling back, scent rising. It smells like hope. Or maybe that's just hunger talking. Either way, you've earned it. You sleep with a full belly tonight. Not full, but full enough that your stomach isn't growling loud enough to wake the local wildlife. The fish was small, sure, but it hit the spot. And in this kind of life, that's luxury. You curl up in your cloak, coal still pulsing a faint red beside you, and drift off to the sound of dripping snowmelt from the roof. But sometime before dawn, a jolt of pain twists in your gut. It's not hunger, it's worse. Your stomach's boiling like it's staging a rebellion. You stumble out of your hut into the cold, and well, let's just say the woods know more about you now than you'd prefer. That's when it hits you. The water. You didn't boil it last night. Or not enough. Welcome to Boil Everything Twice. A medieval lesson in hydrating without dying. You sit there, pale, chilled, and empty, mentally tracing back every mistake. The stream seemed clean, cold, fast-moving, even sparkling in the sunlight. But that means nothing out here. It might be carrying bacteria, parasites, or worse, runoff from upstream where a dead animal is slowly becoming someone else's dinner. In the Middle Ages, they didn't know about E. coli or Giardia, but they knew water could kill you. So they boiled it. Always. Twice, if they could manage the fuel. First to clear the visible stuff, second to be sure the invisible nastiness was gone. It wasn't just superstition, it was survival. You drag yourself back inside, light a weak fire with shaky hands, and fill your clay pot with snow. It melts down to a depressingly small puddle, maybe half a cup. You repeat the process, again and again, until you have enough to boil. It takes forever. The fire smokes, the water bubbles. You wait and wait. You don't just bring it to a boil, you hold it there. Let the heat kill whatever's lurking. Then, when it's cooled a little, you boil it again. The second boil isn't overkill, it's peace of mind. Medieval people didn't always understand the science behind this, but they absolutely connected bad water with illness. In monasteries, water for drinking was often filtered through layers of cloth or charcoal before boiling. In towns, people fetched water from clean wells or springs, avoiding rivers near tanneries or cemeteries, and when all else failed, they brewed it. Beer wasn't just for fun, it was public health. The boiling process used to brew ale made the water safe, and the low alcohol kept it preserved. Even children drank it. In some towns, small beer was more common than water itself. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. In parts of medieval Japan and China, boiling water wasn't just about survival, it became ritual. Tea culture emerged partly from the simple fact that boiling your water helped keep you alive. The practice of boiling, straining, and flavouring water became deeply social. Meanwhile, in medieval Europe, nobody was throwing tea parties, but they were tossing rosemary or sage into boiling pots, trying to mask the flavour of stagnant or brackish water, with herbs that might, or might not, have medical benefits. But back to you, hunched over your fire, sipping steaming water from a cracked cup like it's the finest wine. It tastes fine, flat, a little smoky, slightly metallic from the pot, but it stays down. No twisting, no cramping. It feels like victory. The debate among scholars continues. How common was boiling water across the medieval world? Some argue that rural folk rarely bothered, relying instead on local knowledge of safe springs and superstition. Others say that boiling was a deeply ingrained practice, passed down from mother to child, reinforced by the simple, grim lesson that bad water equals bad death. In plague times, when disease spread like wildfire, many believed that boiling water and purifying it with fire could ward off the invisible poison in the air and the body. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Not everyone boiled everything, but enough did to make the tradition survive. In castles, kitchens kept pots on slow simmer. On the road, travellers learned to melt snow or collect rain and boil it over tiny fires. and in households where firewood was scarce, people made bitter compromises. Drink now and risk it, or go thirsty and fade. You sit by your fire, sipping slowly, letting the warmth settle. Your guts calm down, your breath evens out. You stare into the pot, thinking about how something so simple, boiling water, can mean the difference between making it through the week or curling up in the snow and becoming someone else's boot donor. It's funny in a grim sort of way how often survival comes down to repetition. Not the big heroic acts, not the dramatic rescues, just the little things, every day, over and over. Boil the water, check the fire, fix the leak, mend the shoes, grind the flour. Nothing cinematic, just necessary. So you add more snow to the pot, watch it melt, let it boil, and you whisper a small promise to yourself. Next time, you won't forget. Not because you're scared, but because you've learned. And in this world, knowledge doesn't just give you power, it gives you breath, pulse, time. The boiled water did the trick. You're not dying, at least not yet, and your stomach's calm enough that the idea of food doesn't make you break into a cold sweat. But there's still the wound on your arm to think about. The spider silk helped stop the bleeding, sure, and the swelling has gone down a bit. Still, the scab is ragged, angry looking, and you know what comes next if you don't treat it. Infection, fever, maybe losing the arm. You've survived this long with mud walls and stolen boots. You're not about to let a little elbow scrape take you out. So today's medicine comes from the pantry, or what passes for one in a dirt hut. It's time to reach for something golden, sticky, and surprisingly powerful. Honey. You sit by your fire, eyeing the small jar you buried weeks ago in a pile of snow. It's thick now, cloudy from the cold. You pry it open and catch that rich floral scent. Sunlight trapped in a jar. This isn't just food, it's medicine. Maybe the best medieval antibiotic that didn't come with side effects or a priest muttering spells over your bed. You dip your fingers in, smear a little onto the wound and brace for the sting. But it doesn't come. It's soothing, actually. Cool and soft, like your arm's been wrapped in silk made of sugar. Almost immediately the skin stops throbbing. It feels better, like your body can breathe through it again. See, honey wasn't just a sweetener in the Middle Ages. It was one of the most important medicinal tools available. It was used for everything: burns, cuts, ulcers, eye infections. The stuff never spoiled. Archaeologists have found 1,000-year-old pots of honey that were still technically edible, and it had real antimicrobial properties. Even if no one back then knew the word bacteria, they just knew it worked. Monks swore by it. So did field surgeons on medieval battlefields. If you were lucky enough to get your hands on raw, unprocessed honey, especially the dark wildflower kind, you had a natural wound dressing with no need for prayers or potions. Just slap it on, cover it with a clean cloth and let the bees' hard work do the healing. Here's your fringe fact of the day. In some medieval traditions, honey wasn't just medicine, it was holy. It was thought to contain the warmth of divine light, given its golden colour and miraculous shelf life. Some healers would mix it with herbs like thyme or lavender, murmuring blessings as they stirred. In Norse cultures, honey was linked to the mead of wisdom, so applying it to your skin was, in a sense, like covering your wound in knowledge. It sounds poetic, until you remember your elbow looks like it got into a fight with a pine cone. Scholars debate how widespread honey's use in medicine truly was. Was it reserved for the wealthy and the monastery stockrooms? Or did peasants also have their own jars tucked away, collected in the summer and hidden like treasure? The answer seems to be both. Bees were kept in woven skeps or carved tree hollows across rural Europe, and while the rich hoarded honey for mead and glazed meat, the poor learned to value it as a cure-all. A small pot could be bartered like gold, or guarded like it. Back in your hut, the air now smells faintly sweet, mixing with the acrid scent of wood smoke. The honey sits on your skin, thick and warm, seeping into the cut. You wrap it gently in a strip of cloth, clean for once, and lean back against the wall, exhaling. Your body still aches, your feet are still cold, but your arm doesn't feel like it's trying to kill you anymore. Progress. You glance over at the jar. There's still plenty left, and that's good because there's no telling what else you'll have to smear it on. A burn, a rash, maybe your sore throat that's been building up from breathing smoke night after night. Honey can help with that too. A spoonful swallowed raw, maybe mixed with a crushed wild herb if you've got one handy. No need for magic spells, though a little murmured gratitude never hurt. You You think about the bees. Somewhere out there, under snow-covered logs or hollow trees, they're huddled in tight balls, keeping each other warm with slow collective movement. You're not so different in a way, just trying to make it to spring, living off what little you gathered in better times. They store honey, you store firewood and bark bread and desperation. You just happen to have inherited their miracle, and for now, that's enough. You sit by the fire, watching your breath curl in the cold air. Your wound is sticky, your arm smells like summer, you feel alive. You wonder how many others, hundreds of years ago, sat exactly like this. Hands wrapped in rags, skin kissed by honey, breathing slow as the darkness settled outside. They didn't have modern medicine, no penicillin, no antiseptic, no gauze, but they had bees and a reason to keep going. That reason still holds, one sticky smear at a time. You wake with your arm cradled close to your chest, half expecting it to be swollen or oozing or just missing. But no, it's fine. Better than fine. The honey did its job, and for the first time in days, the wound doesn't look like it's part of a medieval horror show. You sit up slowly, blinking in the grey morning light, and realise something horrifying. It's cold. Colder than before. That bite in the air isn't just winter being dramatic, it's frostbite weather. And the worst part, you're wearing metal. Your chainmail, or what's left of it, isn't for show. You found it days ago on a long-abandoned body half buried under ice. A partial shirt, rusted in places, heavy and awkward, but you kept it. Not because you were expecting a sword fight, but because it made you feel safer, stronger, like someone you used to be, or might be again. But now, it's turning into a problem. Because chainmail, in the cold, is basically wearable death. This is the part most modern survivalists forget. Medieval armour wasn't worn bare. No knight walked into a blizzard with metal pressed directly to skin, unless they had a deep, aching desire to be a human popsicle. That's where layering tricks came in. Soft barriers, careful insulation, and more fabric than a travelling puppet show. So you strip off the chainmail, teeth chattering as the cold hits your sweat-damp tunic. You hang the metal shirt near the fire, then dig into your bag for whatever you can layer. First comes the undertunic, rough-spun wool, scratchy enough to exfoliate your soul. Then the padded gambeson, your real defence against the cold. It's thick, quilted linen designed not just to absorb a sword blow, but to trap heat close to your body. It's heavy, stiff, but it works. Back in the day, this was standard. Armour wasn't a single-layer situation. A knight in winter wore underclothes, a padded jack or gambeson, sometimes two if he could stand the weight, and only then the chainmail. On top of that, a cloak, usually wool and often fur-lined if he was lucky or rich. The idea wasn't just to fight, but to fight and not freeze to death before the battle started. You follow the routine like muscle memory you never knew you had. Shirt, gambeson, mail. Then a belt to cinch it all close. Every layer traps a little more warmth. You tuck the sleeves in tight, pull your hood down, and feel the world settle just a little. The weight is crushing, but it's oddly comforting, like walking around in a portable hug made of cloth and metal. Here's a strange little historical footnote. In particularly brutal winters, knights and soldiers soaked their outer layers in water before battle. Why? To make them harder to burn. Think about it. If your enemies are flinging fire arrows or oil, a wet cloak might be the difference between life and being roasted alive. It also added an extra layer of ice armour once the water froze, though nobody liked that part. You try to imagine yourself drenching your only cloak before trudging out into a snow-covered clearing, and you shiver just thinking about it. Still, if it's between freezing and flambe, you know what you'd choose. There's debate, as always. Some scholars argue that freezing temperatures weren't common enough in battlefields to require all this winter layering nonsense. Others say knights were absolutely prepared for cold, especially in the northern parts of Europe where winter campaigns were just part of the calendar. What's certain is that if you wore metal in cold weather without preparation, you'd suffer. Metal pulls the heat out of your body like a greedy ghost, and if it gets cold enough it can stick to your skin like a medieval tongue-on-flagpole situation. Unpleasant doesn't begin to cover it. Back in your hut, you finally pull the chainmail back on, now resting over 3 layers of fabric. It still clinks and tugs at your shoulders, but it doesn't burn with cold anymore. You stretch, crack your neck, and step outside, steam rising off your breath like you're your own chimney. The cold is still there, sharp and punishing. but it's not chewing on your bones anymore. You've built a wall between yourself and the weather, thread by thread, ring by ring. You glance at the horizon. The snow's falling again, lazy flakes drifting like ash. You've got maybe 2 hours before the light fades. Enough time to gather more firewood, maybe check your fish traps, patch that leak in the back wall of your hut. You tug your cloak tighter and start walking, boots crunching in the snow. You can feel the difference in your steps. You're heavier, sure, but solid. The kind of solid that says you're not going to freeze just because the wind decided to throw a tantrum. You're wrapped, padded, protected. Not just from swords and arrows, but from the slow, creeping death that is cold in the wrong places. Medieval life wasn't romantic. It was practical, brutal, brilliant. And sometimes that brilliance looked like 3 shirts under a rusty chainmail shirt you didn't even own last week. You adjust your layers and keep moving. Not fast, not warm, but ready. You've been walking all morning, wrapped in your layers of cloth and chainmail, the cold less biting now but still very much part of the air. Your breath fogs in front of you, and your limbs feel heavy, not from exhaustion exactly, but from the weight of everything you're carrying. Every step is effort, every mile feels like 2. You reach a clearing and pause beside a tree, snow crunching underfoot, and realise you're thirsty. Not just a sip would be nice thirsty, but deep, bone-dry, mouth full of ash thirsty. And the irony, you're surrounded by water. It's just all frozen, or buried, or filled with things you don't want in your bloodstream. You need clean water and you need something to carry it in. You crouch down, scoop up a handful of snow and stuff it into your mouth. It melts instantly, but it steals your body heat in the process. You shiver hard like someone flipped a switch inside your spine. There's got to be a better way, and there is. You're just going to need a goat, or at least what's left of one. Time to talk about gut bladders, the medieval canteen you never wanted but might now seriously consider. You trek back to your shelter, where your dwindling supplies and yesterday's rabbit bones are strewn beside the hearth. You don't have a goat, but you remember the animal carcass you scavenged 2 days ago. Skin already used, meat long gone, but maybe, just maybe, the organs are still usable. You dig through the remains with a grimace, searching through partially frozen viscera until you find it. The bladder. Or if not the bladder, the stomach. Either will do in a pinch. This isn't new. In the Middle Ages, gut bladders were a regular part of food preservation and fluid transport. Hunters, travellers and shepherds used them to carry water, milk or ale across long distances. Cleaned, stretched and tied off at the ends, they became soft, flexible containers. Lightweight, durable and incredibly gross at first. You rinse the organ with snow melt, then turn it inside out, scraping gently with the edge of your knife. The smell is eye-watering, sharp and sour, but you keep at it. You rinse again and again. Finally, you let it soak in a pot of warm water by the fire with a pinch of wood ash stirred in. This helps neutralise the odour and finish breaking down the last of the organic slime. Hours later, you've got a makeshift canteen. You tie one end shut with sinew, fill it with boiled water, and knot the other end after squeezing out the air. It's not pretty, it's not even symmetrical, but it holds. You lift it to your lips and squeeze gently, watching a thin stream arc out. Success. There's something deeply weird and deeply brilliant about this. Medieval survival wasn't about elegance, it was about utility. You used every part of the animal, meat for food, bones for tools, hide for warmth, guts for transport. If you didn't use it, it went to waste. And waste, in a world like this, was a luxury no one could afford. Here's your quirky fact of the day. In some parts of the medieval world, gut bladders weren't just for holding water. They were used to carry ink, medicinal tinctures, and even illegal spirits. Booze, not ghosts. In certain areas, smugglers tucked wine or liquor into goat bladders tied beneath their cloaks, slipping past taxmen with pouches of fermented rebellion sloshing at their sides. Somewhere, a very cold, very underpaid customs officer was being outwitted by a guy carrying a bladder of brandy under his tunic. Scholars argue about how common gut canteens actually were. Some say they were mostly used by nomadic groups or people living far from towns. Others insist they were widespread, especially in regions where pottery broke too easily and wooden vessels were too valuable to risk on long journeys. Archaeological evidence is rare. Bladders don't exactly preserve well, but medieval texts mention them often enough to confirm their use, even if they don't always go into the charmingly disgusting details. Back in your shelter, You loop a cord around your new water pouch and hang it from a roof beam. It swings slightly, the firelight catching on its slick surface. You sip from it now and then, and while the taste still carries a hint of something organic, it's not awful. It's better than licking snow. It's better than nothing. And the real comfort is in knowing you have water. You don't have to sprint to a stream or melt handfuls of snow just to wet your throat. You've got storage, transport, autonomy, even if your container looks like it was made by a bored goblin with questionable hygiene. You rest back against the wall and exhale. Every problem has a solution out here. It just depends on how far you're willing to go. Some people bring metal flasks. You stitch together a goat organ. Different philosophies, same result. Survival is rarely dignified. But it works. You wake with a full gut bladder hanging over your fire and a sense of grim satisfaction. Water, warmth, and a still attached arm. All good signs. But your stomach has started its usual campaign of low, persistent groaning. The last fish you caught is long gone, and the bark bread didn't last. You can't eat snow, and you're not lucky enough to stumble on a deer every time you get hungry. So what now? You stare at your supplies, if you can call a few sticks, some cloth, and a cracked pot supplies, and accept the truth. You've got to get creative again. Luckily, the forest has one more gift to offer, and it doesn't involve hunting, farming, or magic. It's time to cook your next meal in a hollow log. You head into the woods, eyes scanning the underbrush, not for food, but for a fallen tree. One that's rotten enough to be hollow, dry enough to burn around, and stable enough to hold liquid. It's not glamorous, but if you find the right one, you've got yourself an impromptu cooking pot. This technique isn't just medieval, it's ancient. Indigenous tribes across continents used variations of it, and in Europe, peasants and woodsmen without access to ironware would use logs, stones, or even bark as vessels. Because when you're dirt poor and trying not to die, you don't wait for a copper kettle to fall from the sky. You find your log near a shallow ravine. It's pine, maybe spruce, split open by time and softened on the inside. You scrape out the loose rot with a stick, digging until you have a long trough-like cavity. It smells earthy and damp, but that's not a problem. In fact, that faint resin smell means it might even add flavour. Win-win. Back at your shelter, you start gathering ingredients. You don't have much. A few strips of dried root, a handful of wilted greens from near the stream, some leftover acorn meal in the bottom of your sack. Not exactly a feast, but stewed together, they might resemble soup, or at least something warm and chewable. You fill your hollow log with snow, let it melt by the fire, then carefully drop in your scraps. No flames under the log though, it'll catch fire. You heat rocks in your fire pit instead, grabbing them with split branches and dropping them into the water one at a time, each one hissing as it sizzles the melt into steam and raises the temperature. This was how it was done for centuries, hot rock cooking. In the absence of metal pots, people heated stones, sometimes for hours, then transferred them into wooden or leather containers to boil water or cook meals. It's a slow dance. Replace the cooled rock, add a hot one, stir, repeat. But eventually the water starts to bubble. You stir with a stick, the ingredients slowly softening into something stew-adjacent. The smell is unique, earthy, sour, a little burnt, but warm. Here's your bizarre but true detail. In parts of medieval Scotland and Ireland, people would sometimes use cow stomachs as cooking vessels, especially in the field. They'd clean the organ, fill it with water and food, and then drop in hot rocks, basically turning the stomach into a biological crock pot. Sounds horrible, works like a charm. There's even evidence that some nomadic steppe cultures cooked in leather pouches, slung over fires or buried in coals. Humans, it turns out, will cook in anything if it gets the job done. Back at your hut, your hollow log stew starts to look vaguely edible. The acorn flour has thickened the water into a pale brown broth. The greens have softened, losing their bitterness, and the root strips float like suspicious noodles. You fish out the last hot stone, let the steam rise, and crouch beside your makeshift trough, sipping with a carved wooden spoon. It's hot, slightly nutty, a little muddy, but it fills your stomach in a way snow never could. Scholars debate how widespread this technique was among medieval European peasants. Some argue it was a last resort method, used only in dire circumstances or by nomadic groups without access to permanent hearths. Others say it was more common than we realise, an everyday solution for those too poor for iron or copper. After all, most archaeological evidence comes from wealthier sites. Poorer people didn't leave behind cast iron cauldrons, They left behind trees, stones, and memories. But oral traditions and folk practices hint that this kind of cooking was part of life's regular rhythm for the very bottom rungs of society. You take another sip. It tastes like smoke and bark and barely remembered meals. But your stomach quiets, your head clears, your fingers thaw. For the first time today, you feel human again, if just barely. You sit back against the hut wall, staring at your smoking, half-scorched log, and chuckle under your breath. You've cooked soup in a tree. It's ridiculous. It's resourceful. It's exactly the kind of thing a medieval peasant would have done on a day like this. And it worked. The log soup isn't winning any culinary awards, but it sits warm in your belly like a glowing coal, just enough to get you through the next few hours without chewing your own sleeve. The fire pops quietly beside you, and the wind outside has settled into that eerie stillness that usually comes before bad weather, or after something worse. You take a moment to check your stores. One shriveled root, a dusting of acorn flour, a questionable mushroom you've decided not to trust. Not great. Your next problem is staring you straight in the face. You need food that lasts. Something you can stash away, forget about, and come back to days, or even weeks, later. And that's when you remember the eggs. Not your eggs, obviously. But the ones you found last week tucked into a shallow nest beneath some low brambles. You'd taken only a couple at the time. Raw, small, speckled, possibly quail. But now you realise they're not just breakfast. They're potential rations, if you can preserve them. This is where the medieval brain really shines. You're about to preserve eggs the old way. Not in a fridge, not with fancy freeze-drying, but with wood ash. Yes, ash. The stuff at the bottom of your fire pit. The very thing you brush off your clothes every morning and curse when it gets in your tea. That ash. It's magic. At least, if you're trying to keep food from turning into poison. You scoop out a few handfuls of the fine grey stuff. No charcoal bits, just soft powder. The key here is alkalinity. Wood ash, particularly from hardwoods like oak or beech, is full of lye compounds. When used properly, it creates a high pH environment that bacteria hate. It's like building a tiny medieval death zone for spoilage. You start with a clay pot. Nothing fancy. You pour a layer of ash into the bottom, nestle in your eggs carefully, pointy end down, just like the old folks would have insisted, then cover them entirely with more ash. Layer by layer, you stack and pack until all the eggs are buried. Then you seal the pot with a rag soaked in tallow, tying it tight with twine. There. Done. In a cool corner of your hut, those eggs will now last weeks, maybe months. Medieval households used this method, or variations of it, throughout Europe, especially during winter or long travel seasons. Salt wasn't cheap, and pickling eggs in vinegar wasn't always possible, especially if you didn't have extra pots or acidic agents. But ash? Every hearth had some. It was free, abundant, and effective. The eggs stay edible because the ash slows down moisture loss and prevents bacteria from slipping through the porous shells. It's not high cuisine, but it's smart. Efficient. Weirdly beautiful in a way that only survival tricks can be. Here's your fringe historical fact. In some regions, especially rural Eastern Europe, people took egg preservation a step further. They stored them in lime water, a mixture of calcium hydroxide and water, creating a solution that hardened the outer shell and preserved the interior for up to a year. Some even added ash or straw into the mix, turning the whole thing into a lumpy grey stew of biosecurity. The taste? Mildly horrifying. But the results? Impressive. There's some debate among historians about how common ash preservation really was. Written records mostly survive from wealthier households with formal kitchens and staff. But oral traditions, passed down through generations of peasants and hillfolk, suggest these methods were often taught by parents and grandparents, used year after year. You won't find them in cookbooks, but you'll find them etched into survival. You place the sealed pot in a dark, draft-free corner and step back like you've just defused a bomb made of breakfast. That's future-use food, tucked away for the leaner days. And oh, they're coming. The snow has already turned icy, and you've noticed that your traps have been emptier than usual. Animals know. They feel the shift before you do. You sit back down beside your fire, dusting ash from your hands, thinking about the eggs under that pot. Little sealed time capsules. Not glamorous, but quietly life-saving. Just like everything else in this existence. You don't get victories in gold or glory. You get them in boiled water, uninfected wounds, and the soft thunk of an egg that doesn't rattle when you shake it. And hey, If nothing else, you're probably the only person in miles with a full egg pot under their bed. That's got to count for something. The wind's rising again tonight, slipping through the trees like a thief, testing every seam in your hut for weakness. You tighten your cloak, stir the fire, and try not to think about how loud your stomach is. You ate yesterday, technically. That bark and root soup held you over, and you even managed to sip from the gut bladder canteen without gagging. Progress. But it's not enough. You need something substantial, something preserved. You glance toward the back corner of your shelter, where the faint smell of smoke clings to the air like a stubborn ghost. That's where you keep your meat. What little you have left. A few scraps of rabbit, a sliver of fish, something that used to be organ meat and now resembles leather. And then, right there in the corner, not quite buried, not quite hidden, is your toilet bucket. Yep, right next to your food stash. Welcome to the bizarre, surprisingly effective, and wholly unsettling medieval solution to resource scarcity, the smokehouse toilet combo. You didn't plan this. No one plans to share a room with both their lunch and their last bowel movement, but here you are, and believe it or not, this was a real thing. In medieval times, especially in rural homes or isolated cabins, space was a luxury. The smokehouse, the storage room, and yes, even the primitive privy often shared walls, or corners. Sometimes it was intentional, sometimes it was just desperation. But it happened, and it kind of made sense. Here's how it works. Your meat is hung over the fire pit, high enough to avoid flames but low enough to bathe in smoke. That smoke keeps it from spoiling. The compounds in wood smoke, formaldehyde, phenols and acids, create a preservative barrier around the meat, drying it out and making it inhospitable to bacteria. It's not perfect, but in the days before refrigeration, it was one of the most effective preservation methods available. And the toilet? Well, it's not much more than a chamber pot tucked away from the fire, often kept warm enough by the same heat that's drying your meat. In some setups, the smoke helped mask the smell, or at least kept the insects away. In others, people believed that burning certain herbs in the fire would cleanse the air, purifying both food and, waste. Did it work? Debatable. But when you've only got one warm room in the middle of a freezing forest, you're not building a separate outhouse with luxury plumbing. You stir the fire and glance up at the chunk of rabbit hanging from a string. It's shriveled now, tough as bark but still edible. Smoke-dried meat can last weeks like this, months if done properly. In fact, this method has been used for thousands of years, across nearly every culture. Vikings smoked fish in their longhouses, Mongols dried horse meat over open fires, Highlanders strung mutton in rafters blackened by peat smoke, and medieval peasants, too poor to afford salt or vinegar, simply hung whatever meat they could catch right above their hearths, praying the smoke would do its job before rot set in. You reach up, slice off a strip with your knife and chew. It's tough, takes real effort, but it tastes like meat, salty, smoky, still faintly gamey. It fills your mouth with warmth. Your stomach quiets a little. You ignore the toilet pot nearby. And here's your unsettling historical detail of the night. In some cases, people deliberately used urine and animal waste in their smokehouses, not as fuel, but as pest deterrents. The ammonia kept flies and rodents away, and the stink served as a crude security system. No one was going to sneak off with your dried venison if it was hanging 2 feet from a composting surprise. Again, not ideal, but out here, effective. Scholars argue about the practicality of these shared spaces. Some suggest that combined smokehouse toilets were mostly found in emergency shelters or tiny single-room cottages, places where there literally wasn't enough square footage to separate food from function. Others think it was part of a larger medieval indifference to sanitation, especially before germ theory became a thing. But surviving architecture doesn't lie. Plenty of surviving peasant homes show signs of overlapping domestic purposes, one hearth, many jobs. Back in your hut, the fire's burning low. The smoke curls upward in lazy ribbons, brushing against the meat, then escaping through the roof hole. The air is thick but warm, dry enough to keep mildew away. You stir the coals with a stick, shift your meat string so it smokes evenly, and think, for a brief, weird moment, how oddly cozy it all is. Sure, you're living in what basically amounts to a medieval bachelor pad with questionable hygiene, but you're warm, you've got food, and the chamber pot's in the one corner where it won't tip over. That's a win. You finish chewing the last strip of rabbit, wash it down with a sip of smoky water and lean back. It's not pleasant, but it's survival. A perfect little portrait of medieval efficiency. Nothing wasted, everything overlapping, no line between life and discomfort. Just one space doing as many jobs as it can without catching on fire. You glance at the meat again, still drying, still holding on, kinda like you. The meat is holding up fine, if you ignore the faint taste of embarrassment that comes from drying your dinner within arm's reach of your own chamber pot. But embarrassment won't kill you, not out here. What will kill you is nightfall without light, a fire without fuel, or worse, no wick for your torch. You still have firewood, barely, but your oil lamp's wick has burned itself into a tiny smouldering stub, and your cloth scraps are down to their last threads. You need a new wick, something fibrous and slow-burning, something flammable but not suicidal. You glance around the shelter, then, somewhat reluctantly, reach for the bone comb tucked in your pack, the one with the bundle of hair still knotted into its teeth. Yeah, it's time to talk about human hair torch wicks, the medieval DIY solution that's one part genius, one part horror, and all parts resourceful. First, don't panic. No one's asking you to shave your head. Yet. But in the Middle Ages, human hair was more than just fashion or vanity. It was a material. People saved hair, collected it, wove it into thread, twisted it into rope, and yes, sometimes used it to light the way. You wouldn't find this in castles or manors. Those folks had beeswax and fancy candles shaped like dragons or saints. But out in the woods, in huts like yours, the poor used what they had. And what they had, after a long winter without soap or scissors, was hair. You sit beside the fire, slowly teasing the hair from the comb. It's coarse, a little greasy, a little tangled, but it's long and intact, which is what matters. You twist it between your fingers, feeling it tighten into a rough little cord. You wrap it around a bit of dried moss for volume, then press the whole thing into the leftover marrow in your lamp bowl. Yep, still working with bone grease as fuel, because that's who you are now. Once it's soaked through, you light it with a glowing coal. It catches slowly, smouldering with a faint sizzle, then flares to life. The smell is haunting, like burnt fingernails and old firewood. But the flame is steady, bright, and you didn't have to give up any more cloth to get it. Here's your fringe fact of the night. In some parts of medieval Europe, hair was used not just for torch wicks, but for curses and ritual fires. Burn someone's hair over a flame while whispering their name, and, according to legend, you'd give them nightmares, or even illness. In other cases, hair burned with herbs and resins was used in healing ceremonies, or to clear out bad air in plague-stricken homes. So yeah, lighting your lamp with a hair wick. Technically magic, also technically disgusting. The science backs it up though. Hair is a protein fibre, keratin, and it burns with a relatively low flash point, which makes it a decent starter wick if you can shape it correctly. It doesn't last forever, but in a pinch, it can hold a flame long enough to light a room, guide your way outside, or get your kindling going. Monks wrote about using plaits of maiden's hair when other materials ran short. Midwives used singed hair to sterilise small tools, and travellers carried little braids tucked into their satchels for emergencies. Of course, there's debate over how widespread this practice really was. Some scholars claim it's mostly folklore, an emergency trick that became exaggerated in later retellings. Others argue that it was far more common than we realise, especially in times of war or plague, when cloth was rationed and oil was scarce. Hair, after all, was always growing, free, renewable and personal. You didn't need to buy it or barter for it. Just wait long enough and your own body would provide. You hold the lamp steady, watching the firelight flicker across the walls. It's strange how something so intimate, your own hair, can become part of something so distant and practical. But that's life out here. Everything blurs. Tools and body, fire and flesh. Nothing is sacred when your needs are this basic. And weirdly, it works. The flame is strong, and the smoke is minimal once the wick stabilises. You can see now, move around, check your traps and egg pot without stumbling. You even write a small note in charcoal on the wall. Just a mark, really. A tally. A reminder that this was the night you lit your way with your own body. You settle down again, tucking the lamp near your bedroll, where it casts long shadows across the beams. The hair wick burns slower than you expected. You feel oddly proud, like you've hacked a system older than the wheel. Because you didn't go without, you adapted. And survival, as it turns out, isn't always about the big decisions. Sometimes it's just finding out what burns and hoping it doesn't smell too bad. The hair wick burned down overnight, a slow curl of smoke trailing from the lamp until it finally guttered out in the quiet dark. When you wake, there's a scorched smell in the air, something halfway between a campfire and a barbershop that's seen things. But it's warm, you're warm, and even though the fire's just coals now and your stomach is loudly voting for a second breakfast, you feel steady. You survived another night on wick smoke and dried rabbit jerky. Go you. But the hunger is real now. Again. You've stretched bark bread and hollow log soup as far as they'll go, and the fish haven't been biting lately. No birds either. Not even the bold, greedy crows that usually eye you from the trees like feathery little landlords. So you head out into the woods, knife tucked in your belt, eyes sharp. Not for big game, not even for rabbits. Today, you're after birds, and you're going to catch one the most medieval way possible, with string, guts, and desperation. The snow crunches underfoot as you walk deeper into the trees toward the thicket where the birds like to shelter from wind. Tiny tracks give them away. Delicate three-toed prints in the snow, darting around the roots and brush. Maybe sparrows, maybe something bigger if you're lucky. Either way, it's time to make a trap. And to do that, you're going to need bait. The kind of bait that stinks. You reach into your pouch and pull out a scrap of dried meat. What's left of the organ chunk you couldn't finish 3 days ago. You crush it between your fingers, releasing a smell that says expired before it existed. Then you slice a thin bit of gut cord from your reserve, dried sinew soaked soft near the fire last night, and knot it into a simple slip loop. This is the snare trap, one of the oldest, simplest, and most effective traps in human history. You've seen it before, maybe even made one once for fun. But out here, it's not fun, it's survival. You anchor the loop to a bent sapling with just enough tension to spring. Then you smear the bait just in front of the loop, place a few feathers nearby for added allure, and hide in the underbrush. Not far, just far enough that the birds think they're alone. And now you wait. Medieval people were masters of traps like these, not just for birds, but for everything that moved. Snares were used for rabbits, foxes, pheasants, even cats if things got really bad. But birds were the best option for lean months. You didn't need a bow or spear, just some string, patience, and something vaguely edible to lure them in. In some cases, medieval trappers would use guts from fish or fowl, tied in tiny nooses and laid along narrow paths birds use near water. In others, they'd dig small pits, cover them with branches and snow, and leave guts or seeds in the centre. The bird hops in, the branch collapses, and dinner is served. These were known as deadfall traps, and while they're more dramatic, they're also easier to screw up. The snare is more your speed. You listen. The wind brushes the trees gently, snow falling in lazy flakes, then a flutter, a chirp. You barely breathe. A small bird, a thrush maybe, hops down, pecking near the bait. It hesitates, looks around, then hops again. You grip your knife just in case, but you don't need it. The bird pecks once more, moves forward, and the sapling springs. The snare tightens, the bird flails. You're up and moving in 2 strides, hand around its wings before it can panic itself into oblivion. It's small, barely enough meat to cover half a bark biscuit, but it's protein, it's real, and it's yours. You murmur something quiet. Thanks, maybe, or just an apology. Then you do what needs to be done. Back at your shelter, you pluck it over a bowl, feathers floating like snowflakes made of dust. You gut it carefully, saving the stringy insides for the next trap. No waste. Not now, not ever. You skewer it on a stick, roast it over the coals, and sit back while the smell fills the hut. It's rich, sharp, slightly gamey. Your mouth waters before the skin even crisps. Here's your odd fact of the day. In medieval Europe, some trappers believed that saying certain phrases while setting traps increased their success. One Italian folk method involved whispering to the string as you tied the knot, something about tricking the animal into believing the trap was a nest. Whether it worked or not is up for debate, but the idea of talking to your trap, it's weirdly comforting, especially out here. And of course, scholars disagree on how much hunting peasants actually did. Some say trapping was common, taught to children alongside how to chop wood or patch clothing. Others argue that laws made trapping off limits in certain regions, especially on noble lands, forcing people to poach quietly or starve quietly. The truth is likely both. People followed laws when they could, and when they couldn't, they followed their stomachs instead. You take the bird off the fire, The skin blisters beneath your teeth, the meat thin but tender. You chew slowly, savouring every stringy bite. It's not enough, but it's something. And tonight, something is survival. The thrush was barely a mouthful, and your fingers still smell faintly of smoke and singed feathers, but you've eaten. The air outside is sharp enough to cut, the snow deeper than it should be for this early in the season, and your boots, bless the dead man who wore them before you, are starting to let in damp around the toes. You've bundled yourself in every layer you've got, but even with wool, ash, and sheer stubbornness, there's no escaping the truth. Winter's here in full, and in this bitter cold there's one very specific threat you hadn't really thought about, until now. Fire, not lack of it, too much of it. Because today, you're going to learn one of the most bizarre, counterintuitive tricks from medieval warfare. Soaking your cloak to not burn alive. You're out walking, maybe foraging for more gut bait or checking the last of your traps, when you see smoke in the distance. Not the good kind, the thick, oily, black plume of someone else's fire. Raiders maybe, bandits, or just desperate travellers who think your moss-covered shelter looks like a decent place to loot. You duck down, heart pounding. You're not looking for a fight, but if one finds you, you've got to be ready. And that means prepping for fire. Back in medieval times, fire was a weapon. A terrifying, effective one. Siege warfare often began with flaming arrows, torches, or boiling oil hurled at gates, walls, and, yes, people. Even outside battlefields, fire was a constant threat. Huts burned. Barns went up like tinder. Your precious little wool cloak, it could become a funeral shroud in under 5 seconds if the flames caught right. So soldiers, especially those who expected to be near open flame, learned to soak their cloaks in water before battle. That's right, deliberately making their clothes wet in winter. Because while wet wool is heavy, cold, and smells like despair, it also doesn't burn. In fact, wool is naturally flame-resistant to begin with, and once it's damp, it becomes almost fireproof. You crouch beside a snowdrift, gather a pile of the cold powder, and rub it into your cloak. It soaks through slowly, turning the outer layer dark and heavy. You press snow into your hood, your sleeves, even the bottom hem of your tunic. It's miserable, but effective. You're not just insulating yourself, you're shielding your only real protection from the worst-case scenario, an unexpected torch. Then just in case, you grab your water pot, fill it with more snow and place it near the fire. If it comes to it, you'll douse yourself. It's not a fun plan, but it might be the one that keeps your skin on your body. Here's your strange but true fact for the day. In the 13th century manuscripts, there are references to fire cloaks, used during siege defence. They weren't magical, or even specialised. They were just heavy cloaks soaked in water, or sometimes even vinegar to prevent combustion. Some guards stationed atop wooden walls would wear them routinely, knowing a fire arrow could land at any moment. And in some cases, these soaked cloaks were also wrapped around weapons, shields, or even animals, especially horses pulling wagons near dangerous zones. Historians still debate how widespread the practice really was. Some argue it was rare, used only by professional soldiers in well-organised armies. Others say it was a peasant trick, passed from village to village, especially in border regions prone to raids and skirmishes. The evidence is patchy. Burned cloaks don't exactly survive for analysis, but the logic holds up. Wet wool doesn't burn, and when the world around you is catching fire, that's all you really need to know. You crouch in your doorway, cloak now soaked and twice as heavy, eyes fixed on the distant smoke. It's not moving closer, not yet. Maybe it's not a threat. Maybe it's someone else doing what you're doing, fighting cold with fire and hoping not to die in the process. Still, you stay alert. The cloak clings to your back, icy and damp, but strangely comforting, like armour made of misery. And you realise something else. This moment, this wet cloak and watchful stare, is what survival is. It's not heroic, it's not thrilling, it's preparation. Quiet decisions that feel awful in the moment but save you later. Soak the cloak, build the snare, eat the bird, boil the water, stitch the gut pouch, set the trap, patch the leak. Do it all without hope of reward, just the reward of being here tomorrow to do it again. Eventually the smoke fades. No one comes. You breathe easier. Your fingers start to go numb, so you slip back inside, peel off the cloak, and drape it over a wooden peg to dry. The fire flickers, the meat smokes, and you press your palms toward the heat, listening to the hiss of steam rising from the wet wool. You didn't have to use the cloak today, but it was ready. And in the world you're living in now, being ready might be the only real kind of luck that still exists. The smoke didn't come any closer. No raiders, no unexpected guests, no flaming arrows. Just wind and firewood. The steady rhythm of survival carrying you through another uneventful and yet entirely exhausting day. Your wet cloak now hangs limply near the hearth, dripping steadily, smelling like something that crawled out of a bog. Still, you don't complain. You're not burned. You're not buried under snow. That's a win. But as the sun slips behind the clouds for what feels like the third time today, you've lost track entirely. Your eyes drift to the fire. The stack of wood is low. You've got maybe one more night's worth. 2 if you ration. And then what? No trees nearby are dry, and the smaller branches are already stripped bare from your last desperate gathering. You could try digging through snowdrifts for twigs, but that's not firewood. That's wishful thinking. And that's when your nose wrinkles and the smell is unmistakable. Warm, sharp, vaguely unpleasant, but not unfamiliar. Dung. There it is, in the corner near your latrine trench. A mound you scraped together with vague plans to bury later. You didn't bury it. You were tired, cold, distracted. And now, that pile might just save your life. Tonight you're burning animal and possibly human poop for heat. Welcome to the ancient and surprisingly sustainable art of dung fuel. You've heard of it, maybe even joked about it. But now, kneeling in the half-light of your fire, rolling dried clumps between your gloved hands, it suddenly doesn't seem so funny. It seems practical, because it is. In the Middle Ages and long before, people in arid or deforested regions burned dried animal dung as a primary fuel source. Cow dung, horse dung, camel dung, goat dung, it all worked. Even human waste in times of need could be dried and used in low, smouldering fires. Not for cooking, usually. That was a line even the desperate avoided. But for warmth? Absolutely. When the wind howled and the trees were stripped bare, fire was life, and dung burned hot. You reach for a dried chunk, solid, light, almost like peat. The heat from the fire has cured it unintentionally. You toss it onto the coals, watching as it smokes, then flares, catching like a log but slower. The smell isn't great, but it's not awful either. Earthy, pungent, more like a barn than a bathroom. You can live with that. It burns slow. That's the magic of dung. It doesn't flash like pine or crackle like birch. It simmers, glows, holds heat. That's why medieval farmers used it in low ovens, and why nomads across Asia and Africa still swear by it today. It takes effort to gather and dry, but the payoff? Hours of warmth. Even charcoal doesn't last this long. Here's your strange but true fact of the night. In some medieval households, families actually assigned dung-collecting chores to children, who would spend hours gathering droppings from roadsides and pastures. The dung was shaped into bricks, called fuel cakes in some regions, and stacked like firewood to dry in the sun. It wasn't a punishment, it was essential. These bricks were stored through the winter and guarded like treasure. Because without them, families froze. In some cultures, dung even became currency, traded between neighbours, bartered for favours, stockpiled like hay. You think of that now as you glance at your humble pile of hastily shovelled waste, realising you might be sitting on your hut's most valuable asset. Of course, scholars debate the extent of dung fuel use across medieval Europe. Some argue it was limited to treeless regions, highlands, open plains, areas with more grazing animals than forests. Others say it was far more widespread, especially during harsh winters or wars, when timber was burned up fast and not replenished. Dung didn't need axes or saws, just patience, and an iron stomach. You toss another piece into the fire and it flares to life with a soft hiss. The warmth is immediate, filling the room like a sigh. You stretch your hands out, flex your fingers, and let the heat soak in. Outside, the wind is howling again. The snow taps against your wall like 100 tiny fingers, but inside, you're warm. The smell might haunt you later, but right now, it's comfort. You lean back, eyes half-lidded, listening to the fire pop and shift. There's something deeply human about this moment. This strange, smelly, smoke-filled victory. A reminder that survival has never been about pride. It's about doing what works, using what's there, turning waste into warmth, scraps into meals, failure into fire, and so, tonight, your shelter smells like dung. But you're not cold. You're not dead. You're not even uncomfortable. You smile to yourself in the flickering light. Because somewhere, deep in the quiet corners of the past, a medieval farmer is nodding with approval. The dung fire burned longer than expected. A slow, earthy warmth that settled deep into the walls and clung to your clothes like a living thing. You slept with your cloak half off for the first time in weeks, fingers relaxed instead of curled into fists, dreams only mildly haunted by smoke and memories of the latrine corner. You wake up sore but strangely rested, and as you stir the coals back to life, something inside you feels capable. You've boiled water in a fungus-lined pot, caught birds with string and nerves, smoked meat next to your toilet, and now you've reached a point where you can say, "Ah yes, dung burns best when it's been aged by guilt and desperation." It's oddly empowering, but now your water's low again. Your gut bladder flask, somehow still intact and only slightly horrifying, holds just a few sips. You need more, and there's no fresh snow nearby, just icy sludge you've already scavenged. Time to fetch more the old-fashioned way. You tuck your knife in your belt, wrap your cloak and head out. You've barely made it 20 steps beyond your shelter when you hear it. A faint, soft trickle. Water. A stream or maybe a seep spring tucked into a nearby thicket. You push through snow and brush until you find it. A slow-running rivulet, barely the width of your hand, winding through rocks and thick roots. You kneel down, cup some into your hand, and sniff. No rot, no froth. Just clean, cold water. It'll need boiling, of course, but it's better than eating ice like a lost squirrel. Then comes the real problem, how to carry it. Your gut flask won't be enough. Not if you want to stretch it for cooking, drinking, washing, whatever semblance of hygiene you're still clinging to. You look around, thinking, no clay vessels, no spare wood bowls, and then there it is, the carcass. You didn't notice it at first, half buried under snow, lying still beneath a pine bough. A deer, maybe. No, smaller. A goat. Frozen stiff, legs curled beneath it, eyes long since pecked away. Fresh enough not to smell, but long enough dead to feel. Usable. And you remember something. Something medieval. Something resourceful. Grotesque. And wildly efficient. The water bladder made from an actual bladder. Or a stomach. Or both. You get to work. The process isn't pretty. You use your knife to open the belly, working carefully through layers of hide and frozen sinew. You find the stomach, shriveled but intact, and the bladder, smaller, yellowish, surprisingly tough. These organs were used across centuries as containers. Cleaned, dried, rehydrated, and sewn shut, they held everything from wine to oil to water. You're going to do the same. Back at the shelter, you soak both in warm boiled water to soften them, then scrape them clean inside and out with the edge of a bone. The texture is unsettling, slick, stretchy, but undeniably durable. You boil them again, just to be safe, then let them sit by the fire while you chew on a piece of dried meat, and pretend you're not turning animal innards into medieval hydration gear. Here's the thing, it works. After an hour or two, the bladder is pliable, clean, and able to hold water without leaking. You tie off one end with a strip of rawhide, fill it halfway from your pot, then knot the other end and set it aside. The stomach is larger, more complex, but once sealed and tied with twine, it too holds water like a medieval thermos. Not pretty, not convenient, but absurdly practical. This was common practice across medieval Europe, especially among herders, travellers, and anyone spending days away from settlements. Goat bladders, pig stomachs, even sections of intestines were cleaned, dried, and turned into flexible containers. They were lightweight, collapsible, and tougher than anything made from wood or clay. In battle, soldiers carried wine in pig bladders tied to their belts. In the mountains, shepherds sipped from water pouches made of sheep stomachs, and in colder climates these organic vessels were less likely to shatter or freeze than ceramic jugs. Here's your fringe fact of the day. In some medieval texts, there are mentions of inflating animal bladders and using them as water wings for children learning to swim. No joke. Tiny goat bladder floaties. The Middle Ages never cease to surprise. Of course, modern scholars still wrestle with how widespread these organ containers truly were. Some argue they were only used in emergencies or specific regions where pottery was scarce. Others point to widespread evidence in both literature and surviving tools, noting that even where metal was available, organ flasks were still used because they worked, and because every part of the animal was precious. You sip from your new bladder canteen. The water tastes faintly of smoke and stomach lining. Not great, but not fatal. You rinse your mouth, wipe your face, and grin a little at how far you've come. There was a time, not long ago, when the idea of drinking from an organ would have turned your stomach. Now it just turns a page in your mental handbook of how to not die like an idiot in the snow. You hang the stomach flask by the door, next to your gut bladder and hair wick lamp. Your shelter's starting to look like the inside of a weird apothecary, or maybe an ancient butcher's idea of a luxury suite. You don't mind, it's home, and it works. Water, fire, shelter, food. A few weeks ago, those were just background noise in your life, things you didn't have to think about. Now they're everything, and somehow you're meeting them all with a knife, some string, and the leftovers no one else wanted. You take one more sip and settle in for the night. Still here, still solving, still surviving. You wake to a strange warmth. Not the heat of your fire, though it's still burning, low and steady, but the kind that comes from deep inside. A slow, creeping calm that your survival instincts immediately mistrust. You're too warm, something's off. Then you realise you're sweating. In a hut barely above freezing, wrapped in damp wool and surrounded by frozen goat bits, you are sweating. It's either a fever or a miracle. You hope for miracle, prepare for fever, and reach for water just in case. The taste hits your tongue with that familiar blend of smoke and stomach lining. Still not great. Still doing its job. You press the back of your hand to your forehead. Warm, sure, but not burning. No ache, no nausea, no shaking. Maybe it's just your body finally catching up, letting its guard down for half a minute. You've been pushing it hard, burning dung for heat, catching birds with string and hope, eating bark bread like it's haute cuisine. Maybe it just wants a break. You decide to give it one. Today, you're going to do something unexpected in your current condition. You're going to sweat it out. On purpose. Not because you're sick, but because you're clever. Because your muscles ache, your joints feel like rusted hinges, and you haven't been properly warm from the inside out in days. It's time for a medieval fix that modern preppers rarely think of, unless they've watched one too many Viking shows. The sweat lodge. Not a spa, not a luxury, a survival tool. You drag yourself outside into the brittle air and start gathering stones. Big ones. The kind that hold heat long after the fire dies down. You stack them near your hearth, feeding the flames until they glow red, pulsing with potential. Then you scavenge the largest cloak you have, still slightly crusted from the cloak-soaking fire prep, and stretch it between bent saplings and long branches, creating a crude lean-to just tall enough to crouch inside. It's ugly, saggy. Looks like a tired tent built by a sleep-deprived goat. Perfect. This isn't just random experimentation. Sweating as a form of healing and warmth goes back millennia. Across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, people built sweat huts, steam tents, and smoke rooms to cleanse their bodies, heal wounds, and restore circulation. In the medieval world, especially among nomadic groups and rural communities, these makeshift saunas were more than hygiene. They were medicine. You pour water over the hot stones, one ladle at a time. Steam rises instantly, filling the little chamber with heat and dampness. You crawl inside, careful not to scald your hands. The air thickens, condenses. You're sweating within minutes. It rolls down your spine, drips from your temples, your muscles loosen, your back cracks. Your breath comes easier, deeper. This is what you've been missing. In medieval Scandinavia, the bastu or sweat cabin was part of village life. In parts of Eastern Europe, especially among Slavic and Baltic peoples, the banya was a place of cleansing, socializing, even giving birth. In colder regions, the ability to sweat indoors, deliberately safely, wasn't just comfort. It was crucial. It purged the cold from your bones, kept circulation alive, helped fight off the creeping rot of sedentary shelter life. And in monasteries, some even believed that sweating could purge sin itself. You're not looking for absolution, just to feel your toes again. Here's your strange but true fact of the night. In some medieval medical texts, sweat bathing was recommended not only for physical ailments, but for mental ones. Melancholia, madness, and bad humours were all supposedly treatable by intense sweating, followed of course by prayer, herbal tea, and possibly a goat sacrifice. No pressure. The scholarly debate? It's ongoing. Some historians argue that sweat huts were regional, specific to colder climates or nomadic traditions. Others suggest they were surprisingly widespread, particularly among the working class and rural poor. Since many were temporary structures, easy to dismantle, hard to preserve, they've left little trace. But the written records remain. Travellers describing strange hot tents in the mountains, priests grumbling about pagans using steam instead of holy water, and somewhere between those lines is the truth. People knew how to warm themselves from the inside out, long before the word spa was invented. Back in your makeshift hut, steam curls around your face, opening your sinuses, flooding your pores. You close your eyes, breathe, let the sweat come. You imagine it washing the soot from your skin, the cold from your bones, the fatigue from your limbs. You're not clean, not really, but you feel new, and that's close enough. You sit like that for as long as you can. When the stones cool, when the steam thins, you crawl back into the open air, gasping at the contrast. Cold hits your skin like a slap, but your core is still warm, still holding onto the heat. You wrap yourself in a dry cloak, sip from your gut flask and let the world settle around you. That sweat, rank, sticky healing wasn't a luxury. It was maintenance, the medieval kind, the kind that kept people sane through endless winters, the kind that turned sickness around, the kind that told your body, hey, I haven't forgotten you exist. You didn't hunt today, you didn't patch the roof, you didn't catch a bird or start a fire with your fingernails, but you gave your body what it needed: heat, breath, stillness. And that counts. You sleep like stone after the sweat hut. No shivering, no twitching awake at every crack of the firewood, no vague dreams about freezing to death in increasingly creative ways. Just heat, darkness, and your heartbeat slowing to something steady for the first time in what feels like weeks. When you wake, your limbs feel heavier, but in a good way. Like your body finally got the message that you're still trying to take care of it. For once, you're not immediately greeted by hunger, cold, or dread. Just quiet. Morning light slipping in through the roof hole, a bird trilling somewhere in the trees, and a feeling, not quite comfort, but close. Something like possibility. Which is good, because today, you're not focusing on your own fire for once. Today, you need something even more rare. People. Not a crowd, not a community, just others, the living kind. Because one person can survive a lot, but no one survives alone forever. Not in the long run, and you're reaching the end of your rope, gut bladder water, bark bread, dung fires and all. You gather what's left of your gear, a pouch with the last of your smoked meat, a length of rope, your knife, a coil of snare cord, and your cloak, which still smells faintly like damp goat. You sling it all over your shoulder and step out into the snow, heading down the old path toward where you think a village used to be, weeks ago, months ago. Who knows anymore? The trees thin, the wind picks up, and the cold creeps back under your collar like it's missed you. You think about bartering, about what you can offer. You have nothing shiny, no coins, no dried fruit or wine or salt. But you do have something that's harder to measure and harder to fake. Skills. This is what medieval survivalists really had. Not stockpiles, not bug-out bags, not walls of gear labelled tactical. They had usefulness. The blacksmith's niece knew how to set a broken arm. The tanner's cousin could make glue from hooves. The herbalist's apprentice knew which moss stopped bleeding and which one caused it. Everyone did something. And when things got rough, famine, war, blizzard, plague, it was the skillful, not the wealthy, who found a place to land. You reach the edge of a clearing and there it is. Smoke. Not your smoke. Other smoke. Thin, controlled, rising straight into the sky like a beacon. You slow your steps, eyes scanning. A hut, maybe two. No walls, no gate. Just a handful of people stubborn enough to stay when the rest probably left or died. You step closer. No one calls out. No one waves. This is a different kind of world now. Trust is a currency rarer than gold. So you wait. Hands visible. Body relaxed, not begging, not threatening, just existing, presenting yourself like someone who might be useful. Eventually a woman emerges from behind one of the huts. She carries a bow, not drawn, but not lowered. She looks like she hasn't smiled in a year. You nod. She nods back. It's not a greeting. It's a negotiation. She gestures with her chin toward the other building. You follow. Inside you find two more people. A man missing a few fingers, sharpening a blade that's seen better centuries, and an old woman stirring something over a low fire that smells like cabbage and defeat. They don't speak, they don't need to, so you start to list what you know. Quietly, plainly. You know how to start a fire without matches. You can make soup in a hollow log. You've snared birds, caught fish with weirs. You can preserve eggs in ash. You can sew wounds shut. You can even make a lamp out of fungus and hair. You don't say it like you're proud. You say it like it's the weather. Just facts. Just offerings. And they listen. Because that's what survival has always been. A skill swap. A quiet barter between people who don't have much but know much. The shoemaker fixes boots in exchange for flour. The widow gives dried herbs to the shepherd in exchange for wool. The boy who knows how to climb trees without falling gets fed because he can reach nests no one else can. It's not charity. It's not friendship. It's a kind of communion. A medieval trustful backed not by promises but by usefulness. Here's your weird, wonderful fact of the day. In some medieval villages, when outsiders showed up after disasters, after fire, after war, after plague, they weren't judged by where they came from. They were judged by what they could do. Midwives were given food before nobles, carpenters before warriors. There are records of villages voting on whether to admit survivors based on their trade. The world didn't care about your past. It cared about your hands. Back in the hut, the old woman tastes her pot and pushes it toward you. No words. Just a wooden spoon and a look that says, "We'll see." You eat. Slowly. Carefully. It's hot and bland and tastes like boiled weeds, but it doesn't matter. You're being tested. Not just on what you know, but whether you can be part of something again. You finish the bowl, she nods once. Outside, the woman with the bow is still watching you. She hasn't lowered it, but she hasn't sent you away either. You set your pack down by the door and speak your first full sentence in what feels like a lifetime. "I can sharpen blades." She raises an eyebrow, then lowers the bow. It's not a welcome, but it's not a rejection either, which in a world like this might be the most you can ask for, and possibly everything you need. So, here you are. Not in a warm bed, not in a stone castle or under layers of velvet, but seated beside a modest fire, surrounded by strangers who aren't quite friends, in a settlement stitched together by cold and necessity. Your cloak still smells like damp goat and dung smoke. Your stomach hums with something that might be boiled roots or possibly boiled regret, and you've just handed your blade over to be traded, sharpened, or repurposed. And yet, weirdly, you feel okay, not safe. That's not a word you throw around anymore, but less alone. You glance around the small cluster of huts, patched roofs, smoke curling from stone chimneys, someone laughing once quietly. These people have survived just like you. With spider silk bandages and fish skin glue, with eggs buried in ash and soup stirred in logs, with guts and fungus and old rituals that the modern world has long forgotten, dismissed as superstition or peasant law, or too inconvenient to bother learning. But out here it's not law, it's legacy, and it's working. The world you came from, the clean one, full of store-bought first aid kits and backup generators and vacuum-sealed meals, isn't coming to save you. And maybe, just maybe, that's okay. Because the medieval world, raw and ridiculous as it was, had already solved these problems 1,000 years ago. Without TikToks, without bug-out bags, without GPS or tactical knives or complex acronyms. They had dirt, fire, guts, a deep intuitive knowledge of the land and each other. So now, before sleep takes you one more time, think about the things you've learned. That fire can come from hair. That food can come from bark and bones. That safety doesn't always look like safety. It might look like a shack full of strangers who haven't tried to kill you yet. And most importantly, that survival isn't about strength. It's about adaptation. About using what you have, where you are, with absolutely no glamour or glory. Just the unglamorous will to keep going. So if you're lying in bed right now, listening to this, wondering what it would be like to survive like that, without electricity, without convenience, without backup, just know this. You could. You're already wired for it. The same stubborn biology that got medieval peasants through freezing winters is baked into you too. The body remembers, the mind adapts, and when all else fails, you still have hair, and fungus, and a pot full of someone else's eggs. Not exactly glamorous, but it beats being cold and dead. So, let the fire crackle low now. Let the frost settle outside your window. Let your breath slow as your heartbeat eases out of survival mode. You've made it through another night, even if only in your imagination. Tomorrow the fire will need more fuel, but for now,